The sun rose each morning into a sky bleached white with heat, and by noon the air shimmered in waves that made the horizon dance and dissolve. This wasn't the pleasant warmth of early summer, when green grass ripples under gentle breezes. This was heat that cracked the earth open. Heat that turned once lush grasslands into expanses of brittle brown stalks that crunched under every step. The drought began in spring and never broke. April rains that usually soaked the plains and coaxed prairie grass to shoulder height simply didn't come. May stayed dry. By June, the creeks that normally ran year-round had become chains of stagnant pools, shrinking daily, ringed with the desperate tracks of cattle and wildlife competing for every drop. Ranchers watched their grasslands with growing unease, but not yet alarm. Bad years happened. The West was unpredictable. Surely the rains would come eventually. Surely this was just a temporary dry spell. They were running more cattle than the land had ever supported. That was the problem, though few admitted it. The rye cattle boom of the early 1880s had been intoxicating. Eastern investors and European nobility had poured money into Western ranching, seduced by stories of limitless grass and cattle that reproduced themselves into fortunes. Ranchers who'd started with a few hundred head now ran thousands. Some operations counted their cattle in the tens of thousands. The math was simple and irresistible. Cattle bought in Texas for $10 a head could be driven north, fattened, on free grass, and sold in Chicago for $40, $50, sometimes $60. The Great Plains were an enormous, rent-free feedlot. The grass was free, the water was free. All you needed was cattle and cowboys to watch them, except the grass wasn't limitless, and the water wasn't guaranteed, and running 10 times more cattle than the land could sustainably support worked fine until conditions turned bad. That summer, conditions turned very bad indeed. Prairie fires became constant. The dry grass ignited from lightning strikes, from careless campfires, from sparks off, wagon wheels striking rocks. Once started, fires raced across the plains for miles, sometimes days, consuming what little forage remained. Cowboys fought these fires with wet blankets and desperate prayer, but mostly they just watched the range burn, knowing each acre of blackened stubble meant less food for the cattle that fall in winter. By late summer, water sources that had never gone dry in memory went dry. Springs that had sustained homesteads for years simply stopped flowing. Rivers that normally ran strong became braided trickles through wide, cracked mudflats. Ranchers began to panic, moving herds constantly in search of water and grass, often finding neither. The cattle themselves began to show the strain. They should have been fat and sleek, building reserves for winter. Instead, their ribs became visible. Their hip bones protruded. They moved sluggishly, conserving energy because they weren't getting enough food to burn. Range cows that should have weighed 900 pounds were coming in at 600, 700 if they were lucky. And still, the cattle companies shipped in more stock. The pressure from investors back east, from shareholders in London and Edinburgh who'd never seen a prairie or a longhorn, was relentless. Maximize the herd. Use every acre. The reports sent back to investors spoke of temporary setbacks and cyclical weather patterns, but projected ever-increasing profits. The cowboys knew better. In bunkhouses and around campfires, they talked about what was coming. You didn't need to be a genius to do the math. Cattle going into winter already weak, grass already depleted, and winter always came to Montana, always came to Wyoming and Dakota. The question wasn't whether winter would be hard. Winter was always hard. The question was whether the cattle and the men who tended them could survive it in their already weakened state. Then came the signs. The old-timers noticed first. In early November, almost a month earlier than usual, the geese began flying south, not in their typical leisurely migrations, but in huge, urgent flocks that darkened the sky and flew from dawn to dusk. They weren't stopping to feed in the prairie ponds. They were getting out. Beavers, whose lodges dotted every creek and river, were observed gathering more wood than anyone had ever seen. They piled branches and logs until their lodges looked like timber fortresses rising from the water. Animals preparing for something. The cattle themselves grew thicker coats, not just the usual winter hair, but shaggy, dense fur that made them look like bison. Ranch hands joked about it nervously. "Looks like the cows know something we don't," they'd say, and try to laugh, but the laughter always sounded forced. Weather-wise ranchers, men who'd spent decades reading the land and sky, felt it in their bones. The air pressure fluctuated wildly. The wind patterns shifted strangely. The autumn sunset cast peculiar colors across the clouds, orange and purple and sickly green, like bruises spreading across the horizon. November brought the first snow, not the gentle, melting dustings that sometimes came and went in autumn, but real snow. Serious snow. It fell for 3 days, accumulated to 8 inches in places, and when it finally stopped, the temperature dropped below zero for the first time that season. That snow melted eventually, as November snow often did, but it served as warning. Winter was coming early. Winter was going to be serious. The smart ranchers, the cautious ones, began laying in extra hay, stockpiling firewood, bringing cattle closer to ranch headquarters, where they could be watched and, if necessary, fed through bad stretches. But most didn't. Most couldn't. The scale of operations had grown too large. You couldn't barn 20,000 head of cattle. You couldn't buy enough hay to feed them through a Montana winter even if you wanted to. The entire business model of open-range ranching depended on cattle foraging for themselves, year-round, regardless of weather. This had worked mostly for years. The previous winters had been unusually mild. Cowboys spoke wistfully of the winter of '85, when temperatures barely dropped below freezing and cattle grazed comfortably all season. Or '84, when snow came late and melted early. They'd gotten complacent. The land had been kind, and they'd mistaken kindness for weakness. In December, the unease grew. The air felt wrong, too still, too heavy. The sky stayed overcast for weeks, a low ceiling of grey that pressed down like a lid. Snow fell intermittently, never enough to cause real problems, but enough to dust the brown grass white and make foraging harder for cattle already struggling. Christmas came and went. Cowboys celebrated in bunkhouses with what meager supplies they had. Some ranches managed a turkey or goose. Most made do with beans and bacon and whatever whiskey had survived the year. They sang songs and told stories and pretended everything was normal, but the worry was always there. A cold knot in every stomach. New Year's Day, 1887 dawned clear and brutally cold, -20 degrees in some places, but clear. You could see for miles, the snow-dusted prairie rolling away to a horizon sharp as a knife edge. Cowboys rode out to check on cattle, found them bunched in coulees seeking shelter from the wind, but alive, still managing. For 8 more days, the cold held, but remained bearable, survivable. Cattle poured through snow to reach grass. Cowboys kept fires burning in bunkhouses and took turns on night watch. Ranchers' wives cooked enormous meals, knowing their men needed calories to stay warm. And then came January 9th. The morning started deceptively calm. The killing wind from the north that had blown for days suddenly stopped. The temperature rose, slightly enough that men went out without their heaviest coats. There was even talk of a Chinook coming, one of those warm winds that could raise temperatures 40 degrees in an hour and melt snow in a day. But this wasn't a Chinook coming. This was something else entirely. The calm before the storm isn't just a saying. It's meteorological reality. The stillness that morning was the pressure dropping, the atmospheric conditions realigning, the sky gathering its strength to unleash something that would be remembered for generations. By mid-morning, the first flakes fell. By noon, the world had disappeared into white, and the temperature, instead of rising, began to fall, and fall, and fall, until cold became something no one on the northern plains had experienced before, until winter stopped being a season and became an enemy that wanted everything dead. The autumn of warnings was over. The winter of death had arrived. The bunkhouse sat low against the prairie, a squat rectangle of rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and moss that had dried and cracked over successive seasons. It wasn't designed for comfort. It was designed to be built quickly and cheaply to house as many men as possible in the smallest space and to provide just enough shelter to keep those men alive through winter so they could work come spring. Most bunkhouses were single rooms, maybe 30 feet long and 15 wide, with a ceiling so low a tall man had to duck under the support beams. The logs were never properly squared, so gaps showed between them, filled haphazardly with whatever materials were at hand. Clay, newspaper, old rags, horsehair mixed with mud. In winter, you could stand in the middle of the room and see daylight, through a dozen cracks, and where light came through, so did wind. The door was thick plank, hung on leather hinges because metal hinges were expensive and had to be freighted in from distant towns. It never quite fit the frame, so a gap at the bottom let in a constant stream of cold air that flowed across the floor like invisible water. Cowboys stuffed rags under it every night. By morning, frost would have formed on those rags, turning them stiff as boards. There was usually one window, if you could call it that, a square cut in the logs, covered with oiled paper stretched over a wooden frame. Or if the ranch had any money, actual glass brought in at considerable expense and constantly at risk of cracking in the cold. Most bunkhouses just had the oiled paper, which let in a murky amber light during the day and absolutely nothing at night. The bunks lined both long walls, stacked 2 or 3 high depending on how many men the ranch employed. Each bunk was nothing more than a wooden frame, rope webbing stretched across it in a grid. And on top of that, if you were lucky, a thin mattress stuffed with prairie hay. If you weren't lucky, just the rope webbing and whatever blankets you owned. The hierarchy of bunks was established and rigid. New men got the worst spots. Bottom bunks on the end nearest the door, where the cold draft flowed constantly and you'd be stepped on every time someone went outside to piss in the middle of the night. Top bunks were warmer because heat rose, but they put you closest to the roof where moisture from everyone's breath condensed and dripped. You'd wake with water spots on your blankets, sometimes ice if it was cold enough. Middle bunks away from the door were prime real estate, warmer than the bottom, drier than the top, away from traffic. Senior cowboys claimed these spots and defended them jealously. If you wanted one, you either waited years or fought for it, and fighting in a bunkhouse full of armed men rarely ended well for anyone. At the center of the room stood the stove, a cast-iron barrel stove or, in better bunkhouses, an actual manufactured stove with a proper firebox and damper. The stovepipe ran up through the roof, and where it pierced the ceiling, there was supposed to be a metal collar to prevent fires. There often wasn't. More than one bunkhouse had burned down from a too-hot stovepipe, igniting dried wood and old bird nests lodged in the rafters. The stove was life. When it was burning hot, the men closest could almost be comfortable. 5 feet away, you could still be cold. 10 feet away, in a corner bunk, you might as well be outside. The stove created a temperature gradient so steep that men on one side of the room would be sweating, while men on the other shivered under piled blankets. Feeding the stove was a constant concern. Firewood was precious. Trees were scarce on the open plains, and what wood existed had to be hauled in by wagon from river bottoms or mountainsides miles away. Some ranches burned coal shipped in by rail, but coal cost money, and ranchers were notoriously cheap about anything that didn't directly increase cattle numbers. More often, cowboys burned whatever they could find: dried cow chips, sagebrush, buffalo bones, of which there were still plenty scattered across the plains from the great slaughter of a decade earlier. None of these burned hot or long. You had to feed the stove constantly to maintain any heat at all. At night, someone had to take responsibility for the fire. Usually, this rotated among the men, with each taking a shift to wake periodically and add fuel. Miss your shift, let the fire go out, and you'd wake to find 20 angry cowboys ready to throw you outside in your underwear to see how you liked the cold. Even with the stove going, the bunkhouse was never truly warm in winter. It was less cold than outside, which was the best that could be hoped for. Your face would be hot from the stove, while your back was cold from the draft. Your feet would be numb while sweat trickled down your spine. Comfort wasn't the goal. Survival, was the goal. Make it to morning alive and functional. That was success. Cowboys slept in their clothes. The idea of changing into night clothes, or worse, sleeping naked, was absurd. You slept in your wool shirt, your long underwear, your thick socks. On the coldest nights, you kept your pants on. Your hat stayed on your head or under it as a pillow, because hats were expensive, and you didn't want someone stealing yours while you slept. Boots were the exception. You took off your boots because sleeping in boots was miserable, and because boots needed to dry. They'd sit by the stove all night, the leather slowly warming and releasing the accumulated moisture of the day. The smell of drying leather mixed with the smell of unwashed men, wet wool, tobacco smoke, and the acrid tang of burning sage or cow chips. The smell of a bunkhouse was indescribable to anyone who hasn't experienced it. 40 men living in close quarters, bathing rarely because hauling and heating water was labor-intensive and rarely worth the effort. Clothes worn for weeks or months without washing, because washing meant they'd be wet and might not dry in winter, and wet clothes could kill you. The privy was outside, so men used a bucket in the corner at night rather than brave the cold, and that bucket added its own special contribution to the atmosphere. Tobacco smoke hung in layers because every cowboy who could afford it smoked too, passed the time. Some chewed and spit into cans or just onto the floor because the floor was already a mess of tracked-in mud, snow, manure, and spilled food. Mice lived in the walls and came out at night to scavenge. You could hear them scratching and squeaking, see them dart across the floor in the stove light. Some cowboys tried to kill them. Most gave up. There were always more mice, as long as they didn't chew holes in your blankets or get into the food. Stores, you learned to coexist. The sounds of a bunkhouse at night were particular. The wind outside, constant, varying from low moan to sharp whistle, depending on its strength and the gaps it found. The stove ticking as metal expanded and contracted with temperature changes. The creak of rope webbing as men shifted in their bunks, the thump of boots being pulled off and dropped on the floor. Snoring. Dear God, the snoring. 40 men in one room meant you'd have at least 10 serious snorers. Deep, rattling snores that shook the bunks. High, whistling snores that pierced through any attempt at sleep. Snores that stopped and started, until you'd lie there waiting for the next one, unable to relax. Sometimes men would throw boots at particularly bad snorers. Sometimes it helped. Usually it just made everyone else laugh and the snorer angry. Coughing was constant. The cold, the dust, the smoke, the close quarters meant everyone had some kind of lung affliction. Dry, hacking coughs that went on for minutes. Wet, rattling coughs that made you wonder if the man would survive the night. Cowboys coughed themselves, awake, coughed themselves back to sleep, coughed their way through the entire winter. Conversations happened in the dark. Men talked about home, about women, about cattle, about anything but the cold pressing in from all sides. Some conversations were quiet, just between neighbors in adjacent bunks. Others involved the whole room, stories being told and retold, jokes that weren't funny but made everyone laugh because laughter was warmth of a different kind. Letters were read and reread by stovelight. A letter from home was precious, and a cowboy might read the same letter 100 times through a winter, memorizing every word, every loop of handwriting, every piece of news from a world that felt impossibly far away. Some men prayed. You'd hear whispered prayers in the darkness, usually from the younger cowboys, the ones still new enough to the work that death seemed like a possibility rather than an inevitability. Older hands didn't pray much. They'd made their peace with whatever was coming, or they'd stopped believing anything was listening. The bedding itself deserves attention. Each cowboy owned his own bedroll, a collection of blankets, and maybe a quilt that he'd rolled up and carried with him from job to job. These blankets were wool, heavy and scratchy, and they accumulated the smell of their owner, along with the smell of horses, cattle, campfire smoke, and prairie dirt. In the bunkhouse, you'd unroll your bedding onto the rope webbing, which sagged under your weight and provided almost no cushioning. The ropes left permanent patterns pressed into your back and legs. After a few weeks, you stopped noticing. Your body just accepted that sleep meant discomfort and adjusted expectations accordingly. On the coldest nights, men piled every blanket they owned on top of themselves. 3 blankets, 4, 5 if they had them. The weight was crushing, but weight meant warmth, and warmth meant survival. Some cowboys, the poorest ones or the newest, didn't have enough blankets. They'd sleep in their coats, under their coats, wrapped in saddle blankets that smelled of horse sweat and mold. The truly desperate would share bunks, 2 men pressed together for body heat, which was awkward and carried implications, but was better than freezing. You'd see this more in the deepest cold, when propriety mattered less than waking up with all your fingers and toes. Getting into bed was a shock every night. The blankets had been sitting in the ambient temperature of the bunkhouse all day, which meant they were cold. Not frozen, but cold enough that sliding under them made you gasp. Your body heat would eventually warm the space between blankets, but it took 20 minutes, half an hour, of shivering and curling into yourself before that happened. Some cowboys heated rocks in the fire and wrapped them in cloth to put in their bunks. This worked for about an hour, providing a spot of genuine warmth for your feet or your hands. After that, the rocks were just heavy, cooling lumps taking up space, and you'd have to decide whether the effort of getting up and throwing them out was worth the loss of heat from opening your blanket cocoon. Sleep, when it finally came, was never restful. You were always partially aware of the cold trying to find you, aware of the fire and whether it was still burning, aware of the other men around you, their sounds and movements, aware that if something went wrong, a fire, a medical emergency, a blizzard bad enough that the whole bunkhouse might collapse, you needed to be able to wake and move. Cowboys learned to sleep light, a skill born of necessity. In summer, you slept light because you might need to deal with stampeding cattle or approaching storms. In winter, you slept light because the alternative was dying without noticing. The nights stretched long, 15, 16 hours of darkness in the depths of winter. You couldn't stay awake for all of it. Candles and lamp oil were too expensive to burn for light. So you slept in stages. A few hours, then wake when the fire needed tending. A few more hours, wake because your body was too cold or needed to piss. A few more hours, wake because someone else was moving around, or coughing, or because your back hurt too much to stay in one position. This broken sleep was exhausting in its own way. You'd wake in the morning having technically slept for hours but feeling like you'd barely rested at all. That was winter sleep in a bunkhouse. Not the deep, renewing sleep of comfortable beds in warm rooms, but the fitful, survival-focused sleep of men living on the edge of catastrophe. Every single night, for months on end. And when the great die-up came, when the temperature dropped to 60 below, and the wind tried to tear the roof off, and the cattle began dying by the thousands, even, that inadequate sleep became nearly impossible. Because how do you sleep when the world outside is ending? How do you close your eyes when you know morning might reveal losses beyond comprehension? You learn because you have no choice. You sleep because your body demands it. Brief, shallow, troubled sleep punctuated by periods of lying awake in the dark, listening to the wind scream, and wondering if you'll live to see spring. Morning came late on January 9th, the sun rising somewhere behind thick grey clouds that had settled over the plains like a lid. Cowboys rolled out of their bunks around 6, the usual time, groaning and stiff from another night on rope webbing and thin mattresses. The bunkhouse was cold, but not impossibly so. Maybe 20 degrees inside, which meant the fire had held through the night. That was a victory. They pulled on boots that had spent the night by the stove, the leather still warm to the touch, stomped their feet to get blood flowing, stretched arms and backs that ached from the perpetual cold. Someone got the coffee going, pouring water from buckets that had a thin skim of ice on top despite being inside. The foreman, A weathered man named Jack Thompson, on one particular ranch in Montana, stuck his head out the door to check conditions. The wind that had been blowing hard from the north for days had stopped completely, dead calm. The air felt heavy, thick, like you could almost chew it. Temperature had risen slightly overnight, maybe up to freezing, or close to it. "Might be a Chinook coming," Jack said, and a few of the men perked up. A Chinook, that warm wind that could raise temperatures 40 degrees in an hour, would be salvation, would give the cattle a break, would let everyone breathe a little easier. But the old-timers in the room, men who'd spent 20, 30 winters on the northern plains, exchanged glances and said nothing. The calm felt wrong. The air pressure made their joints ache more than usual. This wasn't a Chinook. This was something else. Breakfast was the usual. Beans warmed up from the night before. Fried salt pork. Biscuits if the cook had bothered to make them, which he usually didn't. Coffee, hot and bitter and strong enough to dissolve the spoon. The men ate quickly, not talking much. Mornings were for eating and getting warm before heading out into the workday. By 8 o'clock, men were saddling horses, checking cattle in nearby pastures, hauling water from the creek, which involved breaking through ice that had gotten thicker each day. The world was grey and still. Snow covered everything in a lumpy white blanket, but it was old snow, crusted and dirty. Nothing new falling yet. Around mid-morning, maybe 10 or 10:30, someone noticed the first flakes. Tiny things, falling straight down. No wind to push them sideways. They accumulated on coat sleeves, on hat brims, on the backs of cattle who stood motionless, already conserving energy. Within 30 minutes, the flakes had gotten larger and were falling more densely. The grey sky seemed to lower, pressing down, until it felt like you could reach up and touch it. Visibility, which had been miles, dropped to maybe a quarter mile, then less. Cowboys on the range started heading back to the bunkhouse. This was going to be a storm, and you didn't want to be caught out in a storm. The foreman sent riders to gather men from distant line camps to make sure everyone got back to the main ranch before conditions got bad. But conditions got bad faster than anyone expected. By noon, the wind returned. Not gradually building, but suddenly, like someone had opened a door. It came from the north, from Canada, from the Arctic, and it came with a howl that made horses shy and men grab for their hat brims. The temperature, which had been hovering near freezing, began to fall. 1 degree, 2 degrees, 5. The wind picked up the falling snow and threw it horizontally. Visibility dropped to 50 feet, then 20. Within an hour of the wind starting, you couldn't see your hand held at arm's length. The world became a screaming white chaos, where direction lost all meaning. Cowboys who'd been a mile from the bunkhouse when the wind started faced a terrible choice. Try to make it back and risk getting lost and dying, or try to find any shelter at all and hole up until it passed. Some made it back, stumbling into the bunkhouse half frozen, faces covered in ice where their breath had condensed and frozen, in their scarves. Others weren't so lucky. A young cowboy named Billy Henderson, 18 years old, had been checking on a small herd in a draw, maybe 2 miles from the main ranch. When the storm hit, he tried to make it back. His horse refused to face into the wind, kept trying to turn and run south. Billy fought the horse, knowing that south led away from shelter, from life. The horse won the fight, turned, and ran with the storm. Billy's body was found 3 weeks later, 15 miles south of the ranch, frozen solid, still in the saddle. The horse had died beneath him, also frozen, its legs locked in a final stride. Billy had tied himself to the saddle with his lariat so he wouldn't fall off. It hadn't saved him, but that tragedy was still in the future. At noon on January 9th, Billy was just missing, and everyone assumed he'd found shelter somewhere and would show up when the storm passed. People didn't yet understand that this storm wasn't going to pass. Not in hours, not in days. The temperature kept falling. By 2 in the afternoon, it was 0. By 4, it was 20 below. The wind, instead of slacking, grew stronger. It found every crack in every wall, every gap in every window frame. In the bunkhouse, men stuffed blankets against the door, hung canvas over the oiled paper window, and fed the stove constantly. But the cold still invaded. Snow didn't just fall. It flew sideways, driven by wind that hit 50, 60 miles per hour in gusts. The snow was fine and dry, almost like dust, and it found its way through impossibly small openings. It drifted through the cracks between logs. It sifted around the doorframe despite the blankets stuffed there. It even seemed to come down the stovepipe, hissing when it hit the hot metal. Inside the bunkhouse, men watched drifts form along the walls. Inside the building, snow accumulated in the corners, under the bunks, anywhere the wind could push it. They swept it out, but it just came back. Eventually, they gave up and let it pile. The sound was overwhelming. The wind screamed. There's no other word for it. A constant, piercing shriek that vibrated in your bones and made thought difficult. It rose and fell in waves, sometimes dropping to a mere roar before surging back to that terrible scream. Men had to shout to be heard 3 feet away. Between the wind's screams came other sounds. The building itself groaning under the assault. The roof lifting and settling, as wind tried to peel it off. The sharp crack of wood contracting in the cold. The rattle of the stovepipe shaking in its collar. And from outside, distant but unmistakable, the sound of cattle, bawling, calling, the sound of thousands of animals confused and frightened and beginning to suffer. The cowboys listened to that sound and knew they were helpless. You couldn't go out in this. Going out meant dying. The cattle were on their own. The temperature hit 40 below by midnight. Inside the bunkhouse, with the stove glowing red hot. The temperature near the stove was maybe 50 degrees. 10 feet away, it was freezing. 20 feet away, in the corner bunks, water left in cups froze solid. Men piled on every piece of clothing they owned. 2 pairs of pants, 3 shirts, 2 coats, gloves and mittens worn indoors, blankets wrapped around shoulders like shawls. Some men wrapped their heads in scarves, leaving only their eyes visible, and still they shivered. The night of January 9th was the longest night most of those men ever experienced. Sleep was impossible for many. The cold, the sound, the fear, the knowledge that outside cattle were dying by the hundreds, by the thousands, all combined to keep eyes open and minds racing. Those who did sleep did so fitfully, waking every few. Minutes from nightmares or from the cold penetrating their blanket cocoons, or from the building shaking in a particularly hard gust. The fire had to be fed constantly, every 15 minutes, every half hour at most, because letting it die meant everyone would die with it. Men took shifts by silent agreement. One would get up, face the cold outside his blankets, feed the stove, and retreat. An hour later, someone else would do the same. All night long through those terrible hours, they kept the fire alive, and the fire kept them alive. But just barely. By dawn on January 10th, 16 inches of snow had fallen, though you couldn't measure it accurately because the wind had sculpted it into drifts 20 feet high in some places, while scouring other areas down to bare ground. The temperature had dropped to 46 below zero. The wind hadn't slacked at all, and the storm was just beginning. This wasn't a 2-day blizzard that would blow through and leave clear, cold weather behind. This was the start of a meteorological siege that would last, with brief breaks, through all of January, through February, into March. The great die-up had begun. Men didn't know that yet, huddled in bunkhouses across Montana, Wyoming, and Dakota Territory. They thought they were waiting out a bad storm. A few days, maybe a week, and it would clear. The cattle would be weak and scattered, but they'd recover. Spring would come, as it always did. They didn't yet understand that the world outside was dying, that cattle were already freezing where they stood, eyes frozen shut, ice forming over their nostrils with each breath, slowly suffocating as they slowly froze. That the open range, cattle industry, the boom that had made fortunes and drawn investors from around the world, was ending in that screaming wind. All they knew was cold. Cold beyond anything most had experienced. Cold that hurt to breathe, that made your lungs ache, that turned your breath to ice crystals before it could fully leave your mouth. Cold that was no longer just weather, but an active presence, a malevolent force trying to kill everything that lived. And the night ahead, the second night of the storm, would be even colder. -50, -60 in some locations. Cold that would crack trees. Cold that would freeze cattle solid while they stood. Cold that would seep through every wall, every blanket, every layer of clothing, searching for the warmth of human bodies and slowly, inexorably, draining it away. The cowboys fed the fire and waited. There was nothing else they could do. The Yiwa storm had them trapped as surely as if they were in a prison. All they could do was feed the fire, wrap themselves in blankets, and try to survive until morning, and then survive the morning after that, and the one after that, day after day, night after night, as the storm continued and the temperature stayed brutally, impossibly cold. The great die-up was no longer coming. It was here. Sleep. During the storm wasn't sleep as most people understand it. It was something closer to losing consciousness in brief intervals, the body shutting down, not because it felt safe, but because it couldn't maintain full awareness any longer. The exhaustion of constant vigilance, of shivering, of fighting the cold that pressed in from all sides, eventually overwhelmed even the most determined wakefulness. In the ranch houses scattered across the frozen plains, families faced the storm, with a different kind of terror than the cowboys in their bunkhouses. Ranch houses were sturdier than bunkhouses, built to last generations rather than just seasons. They had proper foundations, real windows with glass, doors that fit their frames. But they were also larger, harder to heat, and filled with children who didn't fully understand why the wind screamed so loudly or why Papa looked so worried. The Ferguson family lived in a 2-room cabin near the Musselshell River in Montana. William Ferguson, his wife Martha, and their 4 children, ranging in age from 3 to 11. When the storm hit that afternoon of January 9th, William had been out checking on a small herd they kept close to the house. He barely made it back, stumbling through the door with ice caked in his beard and eyebrows, his face raw and bleeding from wind-driven snow. Martha had already pulled all the children into the main room, the one with the fireplace. The second room, the bedroom, was abandoned for the duration. You couldn't heat both rooms. You had to choose, and you chose the one with the fire. The children helped drag mattresses and blankets from the bedroom, piling them on the floor near the hearth. By nightfall, the temperature inside that bedroom, separated from the main room by just a thin wooden door, had dropped below freezing. Frost formed on the inside walls. The wash basin Martha had left on the dresser froze solid, expanding and cracking the ceramic bowl with a sharp report that made everyone jump. In the main room, the family arranged themselves for a siege. William stacked firewood within arm's reach of the fireplace, more wood than he'd normally burn in a week. Martha filled every pot and pan with water, knowing that if the storm lasted, they wouldn't be able to get to the well. The pump would freeze. The well itself might freeze. Water was survival. The children sensed their parents' fear and grew quiet, subdued in a way children rarely are. They huddled together on the mattresses, watching the fireplace with wide eyes as their father fed it log after log. The fire roared, consuming wood at an alarming rate, but even standing directly in front of it, you could feel the cold at your back. That first night, nobody truly slept. The children dozed fitfully, waking every time the wind hit a particularly violent gust, every time the house shook, every time their father got up to add wood to the fire. Martha sat up through most of the night, mending by firelight, her hands moving automatically through familiar motions, while her mind worried at the problem of how long their supplies would last. William dozed in his chair, the rifle across his lap, though what good a rifle would do against a blizzard he couldn't have, said. It was simply habit, the frontier habit of being armed, of being ready. When you couldn't do anything useful, you could at least maintain the posture of readiness. The second night was worse. By then, the storm had been blowing for 30 hours straight. The temperature had dropped to 50 below outside, which meant maybe 30 below in the unheated bedroom. And even with the fire blazing in the main room, it was barely freezing where they slept. They'd pulled every blanket in the house onto the mattresses on the floor. Wool blankets, quilts made from scraps of fabric, buffalo robes William had traded for years ago. The family slept together, all 6 of them in a pile, sharing body heat like animals in a den. The children in the middle, where it was warmest, the parents on the outside, taking the brunt of the cold that radiated from the walls despite the fire. Martha sang to the children before sleep, or what passed for sleep. Old songs her mother had taught her, lullabies in German that the children didn't understand, but found comforting anyway. Her voice was soft, almost lost under the shriek of the wind, but the children pressed close and listened. William lay on, his back, staring at the ceiling, listening to the roof creak and groan. Every gust of wind made him tense, waiting for the moment when the roof would tear free and expose them all to the killing cold. It never did, but the fear never left either. Sleep came in stages. The youngest child, 3-year-old Emma, went first, exhausted from crying earlier in the day. She whimpered and fussed until her eyes finally closed and her breathing deepened. Her 7-year-old brother James followed, fighting sleep as long as he could, determined to be brave, to stay awake like the adults. But his eyes drooped, opened, drooped again, and finally stayed closed. The 2 older children, 11-year-old Sarah and 9-year-old Thomas, took longer. They understood more, worried more, and their minds wouldn't quiet. Sarah kept asking when the storm would end. Thomas asked if the cattle were all right, if Papa's horse had made it to the barn, if the chickens in the coop behind the house had frozen yet. Martha answered in soothing murmurs, not really answering at all, just making comforting sounds until the children's questions trailed off and their breathing slowed. She waited until she was sure they were deeply asleep before she allowed herself to close her own eyes. But closing her eyes wasn't sleeping. It was resting with her ears still alert, still tracking every sound. The fire crackling, William shifting position, the wind pounding against the walls, the house settling with creaks and groans. Her mind catalogued each sound, assessed whether it meant danger, and only when satisfied the house still stood did she allow herself to drift towards something like sleep. William didn't sleep at all that second night. He dozed for minutes at a time, jerking awake at every sound, every change in the wind's pitch. Twice he got up to add wood to the fire, moving carefully to avoid stepping on children. Each time he stood, the cold away from the fire hit him like a physical blow. The air near the ceiling was noticeably colder than the air near the floor. Heat rose but couldn't escape fast enough through the gaps in the roof, so it pooled up there, wasted, while down where they slept, it was barely enough. Around midnight, by William's pocket watch, Emma woke crying. She was cold, she said, her teeth chattering. Martha pulled the child against her chest, wrapping her arms around her, trying to share warmth. Emma's feet were like ice, even though she wore wool socks and was buried under blankets. Martha rubbed the small feet between her hands, trying to restore circulation, terrified of frostbite. The child eventually quieted and fell back into restless sleep. But Martha stayed awake, feeling those cold little feet pressed against her stomach, wondering how much longer the storm could possibly last. The third night, exhaustion had set in so deeply that sleep came easier, even though conditions had gotten worse. The temperature outside bottomed out at 63 below zero. Inside, with the fire consuming wood at a frightening rate, they'd managed to keep the room at maybe 15 degrees, cold enough to see your breath, cold enough that the water in the pots near the fire had a skim of ice if you didn't stir it regularly, but not cold enough to kill. Not yet. The family had learned the rhythm of storm sleep. The children slept piled in the center, a tangle of arms and legs and shared warmth. the parents took turns in short shifts. Martha sleeping for 2 hours while William tended the fire and watched. Then William sleeping for 2 hours while Martha kept vigil. During her watch, Martha would sit close to the fire, feeding it, listening to her children breathe, and praying silently. She'd been raised Lutheran, not given to emotional displays, of faith, but now she prayed with desperate intensity. For the storm to end, for the wood to last, for her children to wake warm in the morning, for spring to come, impossible as that seemed in the howling dark. During his watch, William planned how to ration the wood, where to find more if it ran out, though going outside was suicide in these conditions. What they'd do when the food ran low. They had beans, flour, salt pork, and cornmeal. Enough for maybe 2 weeks if they were careful. But what if the storm lasted longer? What if they couldn't get to town when it ended because the snow was too deep? These thoughts circled endlessly, keeping him awake even during his supposed sleep shifts. He'd lie down, close his eyes, and his mind would immediately start calculating. How many logs they'd burned, how many were left, how cold it was, how long they could survive. The children slept better than the adults, helped by the simple resilience of youth. Their bodies demanded sleep and they gave in to it, even in conditions that would have seemed impossible before the storm. Sarah dreamed of summer, of the garden behind the house heavy with tomatoes and beans. Thomas dreamed of cattle drives, of riding with the cowboys to distant railheads. James dreamed confused child dreams that he couldn't remember on waking. Emma didn't dream at all, or if she did, they were wordless and forgotten. They'd wake periodically, usually needing to pee, which meant using the chamber pot in the corner because going to the outhouse meant death. The chamber pot became part of the room's landscape, emptied by William each morning by simply opening the door and throwing its contents out into the snow. It would freeze before it hit the ground. Martha developed a system for keeping track of the children during sleep. She'd reach out periodically, feeling for each small body, making sure everyone was still breathing, still warm enough. If a child had worked their way to the edge of the pile where it was colder, she'd gently pull them back to the center. If blankets had been kicked off, she'd rearrange them. This constant vigilance meant she never truly rested. Even during her sleep shifts, part of her brain stayed active, monitoring. She'd wake fully alert if a child coughed or moved suddenly, ready for crisis. Only after checking that everything was fine would she allow herself to drift back down. By the fourth night, a strange numbness had set in. The storm continued, would continue, had always been continuing, and would always continue. It became hard to remember a time before the storm, hard to imagine a time after. The world had narrowed to this room, this fire, this pile of blankets, these bodies pressed together against the cold. Sleep became deeper out of sheer exhaustion. The body can't maintain high alert indefinitely. At some point it simply gives up and crashes, regardless of external conditions. The children slept hard, twitching occasionally, making small sounds, but not fully waking. Martha and William slept in longer stretches, waking only when their internal alarms screamed that the fire needed tending or a child needed checking. The quality of that sleep was poor, dreams were vivid and often nightmarish. Martha dreamed of water freezing in her children's lungs, turning them to ice from the inside out. William dreamed of the roof tearing away and snow pouring in, burying them all in a white tomb. They'd wake gasping, hearts pounding, and need several seconds to remember where they were, that they were still alive, that the nightmare wasn't real. Not yet, but underneath the nightmares was the simple, animal relief of being horizontal, of having their eyes closed, of not having to actively fight the cold for a few hours. Their bodies took what rest they could get, storing it against future need, repairing what damage they could before the next crisis. In bunkhouses across the territory, cowboys experienced similar struggles. The difference was they had no children to protect, which freed them from that particular anxiety, but they also had less motivation to push through. A man alone can give up more easily than a father with children depending on him. Some cowboys did give up, in a sense. They wrapped themselves in every blanket they owned, lay down in their bunks, and simply stopped trying. They'd sleep for 20 hours straight, only waking to eat a little and relieve themselves before returning to their cocoons. This wasn't laziness, it was a survival strategy. In extreme cold with limited food, the best thing you can do is stay still, conserve energy, and wait. Others couldn't do it. The type of man who became a cowboy was often too restless, too active, to simply lie still for days. They'd pace the bunkhouse, drive everyone else crazy, gamble with cards or dice, anything to pass the time and distract from the gnawing fear that the storm might never end. In both bunkhouses and ranch houses, sleep became not rest, but simply another way of enduring. The days and nights blurred together into a continuous state of semi-consciousness, where you were never fully awake, but never fully asleep either. Your body was present, wrapped in blankets near a fire, but your mind wandered strange paths, disconnected from reality. And through it all, the wind screamed. The cold pressed in, the fire consumed wood, and people slept, or tried to sleep, or pretended to sleep, because what else could they do? Going outside meant dying. Staying awake meant slowly going insane from the sound and the fear. So they slept. Poorly, fitfully, desperately. But they slept. And each morning they woke, surprised on some level to find themselves still alive, still, together, the fire still burning. The storm would eventually end, but not yet. Not for many days yet. And each of those days would require sleep stolen from between crises, rest grabbed in brief intervals, dreams haunted by cold and wind, and the terrible knowledge that outside the world was dying. The cattle felt the storm coming before any human did. Their instincts, honed by millennia of evolution, read signs in the air pressure, in the quality of light, in the way the wind tasted. When the first flakes began to fall on January 9th, cattle across the northern plains began to move, not panicked running, purposeful drifting, south, always south, away from the north wind that carried death in its teeth. They moved in groups, small herds combining into larger herds, thousands of animals flowing across the white landscape like a slow river seeking lower ground. Consider one cow, a 3-year-old Hereford mix, red and white, branded with the Rocking M brand on her left hip. She'd been born on this range, knew every coulee and creek, had survived 2 previous winters without particular hardship. She was carrying a calf, due in spring, and the pregnancy had left her thinner than usual going into winter. Not starving, but without the thick layer of fat that would have been ideal. When the snow started falling heavily and the wind began to rise, she was grazing, in a shallow draw with perhaps 50 other cattle. They'd been pouring through existing snow to reach the dried grass beneath, working methodically, conserving energy. The new snow started covering the ground quickly, and the cow lifted her head, testing the air. The wind came from the north with a sound like tearing fabric. The cow turned her back to it instinctively, and every other animal in the draw did the same. They began walking south, not because they knew south led to safety, but because south meant away from the wind, and the wind had to be avoided. They walked steadily for hours. The snow was falling too thickly to see more than a few feet ahead, but cattle can navigate by sense of smell and by following the animal in front of them. The cow found herself in the middle of the group, which offered some shelter from the wind, but also meant she had to keep moving at whatever pace the herd set. By nightfall, they'd walked perhaps 5 miles. Not far, but the constant fighting against wind and snow was exhausting. The temperature had dropped dramatically, and the cow's breath froze in clouds of white vapor. Ice was forming on her eyelashes, making it hard to see. Her legs ached from pushing through snow that was now knee-deep in places. The herd came to a fence line, relatively new barbed wire strung between posts, to mark the boundary of someone's claimed range. The cattle turned and walked along the fence, looking for a way through or around. They found neither. The fence extended as far as they could sense in both directions. Cattle aren't stupid, but they aren't problem solvers either. Finding their path blocked, they simply stopped. They stood with their backs to the wind, pressed against the fence line, and waited. For what, they couldn't have said. For the wind to stop. For the fence to disappear. For whatever force had always eventually made things better to make things better now. But things didn't get better. The wind increased. The temperature kept dropping. Snow accumulated on the cattle's backs. A heavy white blanket that they couldn't shake off because their muscles were already occupied with shivering, with the constant work of generating heat. The cow stood and shivered. Her body burned calories, trying to stay warm, calories she'd gotten from grass, but she hadn't eaten since morning and wouldn't be able to eat until she could paw through snow to reach grass beneath. She tried, lowering her head and pushing at the snow with her muzzle, but the wind-packed snow was too hard. Her hooves couldn't break through it either. Around her, other cattle made similar attempts. A few managed to find thin spots in the snow and got a few mouthfuls of dried grass. Most got nothing. They stood and shivered, and slowly, gradually, their body temperatures began to drop. Cattle can survive remarkable cold if they're well fed and can escape the wind. But these cattle were already weakened from a summer of drought. They had no windbreak, and they weren't eating. Their situation was unsustainable. Something would have to change or they would die. It was that simple. By the second day, the cow's suffering had intensified. She'd been standing for more than 24 hours straight. Her legs trembled with fatigue. Ice had completely sealed her eyes shut. She'd stopped trying to open them, instead navigating by sound and smell, and the feel of other cattle pressed against her on either side. Her ears, exposed to the wind, had frozen. The tissue was dying, would eventually slough off if she survived, leaving her with shortened, mangled ears. But that was future pain. Present pain was the cold that had worked its way into her joints, making every small movement agony. The hunger that gnawed at her belly. The thirst because she couldn't melt snow fast enough in her mouth to get adequate water. The calf inside her still moved occasionally, little kicks and shifts that she could feel. Some part of her body was still prioritizing that calf, still sending nutrients and warmth to the growing life within. But those resources were running out. The calf was drawing on reserves that no longer existed. Around her, other cattle were in similar condition, some worse. A few calves, born too early that spring and smaller than they should be, had already died, frozen solid while standing, their mothers standing next to them and occasionally lowing in confusion. Older cattle, those with the wisdom of many winters, had tried to move away from the fence to find a coulee or draw that might offer windbreak. Some succeeded and survived. Most simply exhausted themselves walking in circles in the blinding snow and returned to the fence line to die with the herd. By the third day, the cow had stopped shivering. This wasn't because she'd warmed up. It was because her body no longer had the energy to shiver. Shivering is a metabolic furnace, burning calories to generate heat, but she'd burned through all available calories. Her body temperature was dropping toward equilibrium with the air around her. She was freezing to death. Her breathing had slowed. Each breath was an effort, drawing air so cold it hurt her lungs into a body that barely had the energy to exhale. Ice had formed around her nostrils, narrowing the passages, making each breath a fight. She was still standing, but only because the cattle around her held her upright. If they'd moved, she would have fallen. Her legs were locked, frozen in position, no longer taking commands from her failing brain. Her heartbeat had slowed to a sluggish thump-thump, thump-thump, each beat weaker than the last. The calf inside her had stopped moving. Whether it was dead or simply dormant, she couldn't tell, and wouldn't have understood if she could. Her maternal instincts, so strong just days ago, had been overridden by the body's desperate attempt to keep itself alive. Sometime late on the third night, or early on the fourth morning, it's impossible to know exactly when, the cow's heart stopped. 1 beat, 2 beats, then nothing. Her eyes, frozen shut, would never open again. Her legs, frozen in position, would remain standing. She'd become a statue of ice and meat, indistinguishable from the living cattle around her, except that she no longer breathed. She wouldn't fall for days, maybe weeks. The cattle packed around her held her upright, and when they eventually moved or died themselves, she'd topple over, frozen solid, and become one more carcass among thousands littering the plains. This scene repeated across hundreds of miles. Fence lines became death traps where cattle bunched up and died in groups. Ravines that should have offered shelter instead became graves as cattle crowded in so tightly they couldn't move, couldn't forage, and slowly froze together into a single mass of bodies. Riverbanks saw some of the worst carnage. Cattle seeking water found the rivers frozen solid, but their thirst drove them to try anyway. They'd crowd onto the ice, break through into the water beneath, and be unable to climb out. The current would push them under the ice, where they'd drown and freeze simultaneously. Spring would reveal riverbanks lined with carcasses, hundreds of cattle stacked like cordwood wherever the current had deposited them. Some cattle, driven by the wind and their own southward instinct, walked until they literally couldn't take another step. They'd collapse in open prairie, curl into a ball, as best their frozen legs allowed, and die where they fell. Snow would cover them within hours, creating smooth white mounds that looked like natural drifts until spring melt revealed the truth beneath. The death toll was staggering in ways that are hard to comprehend. A single large ranch might lose 10,000 head. Smaller operations lost everything. The Chicago stockyards, which normally received thousands of cattle per week from the northern plains, received almost none for months. The market for beef collapsed because there were no cattle left to sell. But numbers don't capture the reality. Numbers are abstract. The reality was hundreds of thousands of individual animals, each experiencing their own version of the cow's suffering. Each one cold, each one hungry, each one slowly freezing while standing in a wind that wouldn't stop screaming. Cowboys, safe in bunkhouses, could do nothing but listen to the cattle bawl. That sound, the massed calling of thousands of distressed animals, carried even over the wind. It rose and fell through the days and nights of the storm, a soundtrack of suffering that haunted the men who heard it. Some cowboys tried to help. They'd bundle up in every piece of clothing they owned, tie ropes around their waists, and venture out into the storm, with the other end of the rope tied to the bunkhouse door so they could find their way back. They'd struggle to where they thought. Cattle were usually unable to see them even when standing next to them, and try to herd them towards some shelter. It never worked. The cattle wouldn't move, or couldn't move, and the cowboys would burn through their body heat in minutes. Barely, enough time to stumble back to the bunkhouse before frostbite claimed fingers and toes. They'd collapse inside, gasping and shaking, and lie near the stove for hours trying to warm up while listening to the cattle continue to bawl outside. Eventually, the bawling stopped. Not all at once, but gradually over days. Fewer and fewer, voices as more and more cattle died. By the end of January, the prairie was silent except for the wind. Silent because there was almost nothing left alive to make sound. The cattle of the open range, those millions of animals that had made fortunes for ranchers and fed the growing cities of America, were gone. The survivors, scattered and traumatized, would take years to recover. Most would never be found, lost in coulees and ravines where their carcasses would feed wolves and coyotes through the remainder of winter. The Great Die-Up earned its name from the cattle. They died in numbers beyond counting, in suffering beyond imagining. And every single death was quiet, private. The animal alone in the storm, except for other dying animals. No comfort, no relief, just the cold and the wind, until the end came, and the shivering finally stopped. Food became an obsession within days of the storm's arrival. Not because people were starving, not yet, but because every meal consumed was one fewer meal in reserve, and no one knew how long the storm would last or when resupply would be possible. Every bite carried the weight of calculation. Every pot of beans represented diminishing stores that might need to last weeks or months. In the Ferguson ranch house, Martha inventoried their supplies on the second day of the storm. She did this by candlelight while the children slept, and William kept watch by the fire. She counted every bag of flour, every pound of cornmeal, every strip of salt pork hanging from the rafters of the cold bedroom. She measured beans by the cupful, rice by the handful, and wrote everything down in careful columns in a ledger book. Flour, 42 pounds. Cornmeal, 18 pounds. Dried beans, maybe 30 pounds, 3 different varieties mixed together in a burlap sack. Salt pork, 14 strips, some thick, some thin. Rice, 5 pounds. Sugar, 3 pounds, precious and rationed even before the storm. Coffee, 2 pounds of beans, still in their burlap sack, aromatic and dark. Salt, plenty, a whole sack, bought last fall. Lard, a good supply, stored in a crock. Dried apples, half a sack, from their own trees. Molasses, 1 jug, nearly full. She did the math in her head, working through possible scenarios. 6 people, eating 3 meals a day. 18 meals per day. If they were careful, if they stretched everything, if they didn't waste a single bite, they had perhaps 3 weeks of food. Maybe 4 if they went hungry. 3 weeks seemed like plenty. No storm lasted 3 weeks, but Martha had learned in her years on the frontier to plan for the impossible, because the impossible happened with disturbing regularity. So she began rationing from day 1, before hunger forced the decision. Breakfast became smaller. Instead of flapjacks for everyone, she made 1 per person, thin and stretched with extra water to make the batter go further. The children complained but ate them anyway. William said nothing, just ate what was put in front of him and drank his coffee black to save the sugar. Dinner became the main meal, usually beans. Martha soaked dried beans overnight in water, then cooked them slowly through the day in a pot, suspended over the fire. She'd add a little salt pork for flavor, 1 strip cut into small pieces so everyone got a taste of meat. The beans cooked until they were soft, the liquid thick and sustaining. Everyone got a bowlful, sopped up with cornbread made from carefully measured cornmeal. Supper was often just leftover beans from dinner, reheated and eaten with whatever bread remained. Sometimes Martha made a thin soup from the bean broth, adding bits of dried apple for sweetness, calling it a special treat to make the children smile. The coffee was for William alone. Cowboys and ranchers believed coffee was essential, more important than food, and William was no exception. He drank it black and strong, rationing the precious beans so he could have at least 1 cup per day. That coffee was his luxury, his reminder that civilization existed beyond the wind and snow. Martha drank tea when she drank anything, made from herbs she'd dried the previous summer. Mint that grew wild along the creek, sage gathered from the prairie, rose hips collected in autumn. The taste was thin compared to real tea shipped from China or India, but it was warm, and it was hers, and it didn't consume their stores. The children drank water or milk, though the milk supply was problematic. They had 1 cow, a gentle Jersey, kept in the barn, and William had to venture out twice a day to milk her. The trip to the barn was only 50 feet, but felt like a mile. He'd bundle in every piece of warm clothing he owned, wrap his face in a scarf until only his eyes showed, and step out into the wind. The cold hit him like a fist every time. In the few seconds it took to cross from house to barn, exposed skin would start to freeze. His eyes would water, and the tears would freeze on his cheeks. His lungs would ache from breathing air that felt like shards of glass. But he made the trip because the cow had to be milked or she'd sicken, and they needed the milk. The children needed the milk. It was protein and fat and calcium and all the things growing bodies required. So twice a day, through the entire storm, William made that 50-foot journey and considered himself lucky the barn was so close. The cow produced less in winter, maybe 2 quarts a day instead of her usual gallon, but those 2 quarts were precious. Martha skimmed the cream off the top and used it sparingly. The milk itself went to the children, divided equally, measured carefully, so no one got more or less than their share. Cooking in extreme cold presented unique challenges. The fire had to be hot enough to cook food, but not so hot it consumed wood too quickly. Martha became expert at judging the flames, adding just enough fuel to maintain cooking temperature while stretching the wood supply. Water was perhaps the most critical resource. William filled every bucket and pot with snow scooped from outside the door, then left the containers near the fire to melt. It took hours for snow to melt into usable water, and the water that resulted tasted flat and strange because it had no mineral content. But it was wet, and it was clean, and it kept them alive. They couldn't wash dishes properly, couldn't waste water or wood heating water for washing. Instead, Martha wiped plates and bowls clean with rags, rinsed them quickly in cold water if necessary, and called it good enough. No one got sick from dirty dishes. There were larger concerns. Personal hygiene went by the wayside entirely. No baths, no washing hair, no changing clothes. Everyone wore the same shirts and pants for weeks, adding layers when cold, removing them when near the fire. The smell in the main room became oppressive, but you stopped noticing after a few days. It was just how things were. In the bunkhouses, cowboys faced similar but different challenges. They had supplies, but those supplies were designed for men doing hard physical labor in normal winter conditions, not for men trapped indoors during the worst cold in recorded history. The typical bunkhouse larder consisted of dried beans, rice, flour, cornmeal, salt pork, bacon, maybe some beef jerky made from cattle slaughtered in the fall, coffee in large quantities because cowboys lived on coffee, sugar, salt, lard, sometimes canned goods if the ranch could afford them, but usually not. Canned goods were expensive and the freighting costs were prohibitive. The cook, if there was one, was usually an old cowboy too stove up for regular ranch work. He'd preside over the cast iron stove like a priest at an altar, creating meals from limited ingredients with whatever skill he possessed. Good cooks were treasured. Bad cooks were tolerated because the alternative was cooking for yourself, and cowboys were generally incompetent in the kitchen. One particular bunkhouse in the Judith Basin had a cook named Old Pete, called that to distinguish him from Young Pete, who wasn't a cook and wasn't even particularly young, but was younger than Old Pete. Old Pete had cooked in army forts, in mining camps, on trail drives. He knew 100 ways to cook beans and could make bread in a Dutch oven that rivaled anything made in a proper kitchen. But even Old Pete struggled with the storm's duration and intensity. His usual recipes assumed men would be working hard, outside, burning thousands of calories daily. Now they were sitting around trying to stay warm, burning far fewer calories. They didn't need as much food, but they were bored and hungry from boredom, and managing those competing needs was delicate. He started making meals smaller but more frequent. Instead of 3 large meals, he made 4 smaller ones, gave the men something to look forward to every few hours, something to mark the passage of time. Breakfast at dawn, such as dawn was, in the constant grey, a second breakfast mid-morning, dinner in early afternoon, supper at dark. Each meal was simple: beans cooked with salt pork, cornbread or biscuits, coffee always, constantly, the pot never empty. Occasionally he'd make a stew if there was meat available, though meat was running short. Most ranches had slaughtered a beef or 2 in the fall and hung the quarters to freeze, but accessing that meat meant going outside to the meat cache, which was difficult or impossible depending on the day. The men ate without complaint, mostly. Cowboys weren't complainers by nature. You ate what was put in front of you and were grateful to get it. But you could see them calculating, same as Martha Ferguson, counting days, estimating stores, wondering how long until starvation became a real concern rather than a theoretical one. Coffee was its own category of essential supply. Cowboys drank coffee the way other people breathed, constantly and without thought. A pot of coffee sat on the stove at all times, thick and black and strong enough to float a horseshoe. Men would pour themselves cups throughout the day and night, warming their hands on the tin cups, savouring the bitter heat. Old Pete guarded the coffee supply jealously. He knew exactly how many pounds they had, how much they consumed daily, how long it would last. When supplies began running low, he started stretching the coffee by reusing grounds. First brew was strong for the morning pot. Those same grounds would be used again for the afternoon pot, weaker but still coffee. Sometimes he'd use them a third time, creating a thin brown liquid that was more idea than substance, but the ritual of drinking it was as important as the caffeine. Sugar went into coffee for those who used it, though most cowboys drank it black. Sugar was also used sparingly in baking, a spoonful in a batch of biscuits to help them rise and add a hint of sweetness. But sugar was running low everywhere, and by the end of January, most outfits were out entirely. Salt, at least, was plentiful. Salt preserved meat, flavored food, and was cheap enough that even poor ranches had plenty. Cowboys ate salt with everything, needed it to replace what they lost sweating despite the cold. Their bodies burned hot from shivering, from the constant work of staying warm, and salt was essential. The mental aspect of food during the storm was almost as important as the physical nutrition. Mealtimes provided structure to otherwise formless days. They were events to anticipate, rituals that reassured everyone that civilization persisted despite the chaos outside. Children needed this structure especially. The Ferguson children learned to recognize mealtimes by the smells from the fire, by their mother's movements, by the rattle of bowls and spoons. They'd gather without being called, eager not just for food, but for the routine. Martha would serve, each child personally, making a small ceremony of it. Sarah first, as the oldest, then Thomas, then James, then Emma. Each child received their portion with their name spoken, a moment of individual attention that said, "You are seen, you are valued, you matter." Then William, then finally herself, always last, always the smallest portion, though no one noticed because she was skilled at hiding it. They'd eat together, mostly in silence because food was serious business, but afterward there might be stories or songs. William would tell tales of his own childhood in Ohio, of winters there which had seemed hard at the time, but were nothing compared to this. Martha would sing in her soft voice, German lullabies or hymns. The children would listen and feel for a moment that everything might be all right. After eating came the work of making food last. Crumbs were gathered and saved for thickening, soup. Grease from cooking was poured into a jar and used again. Bones from salt pork were boiled to extract every bit of flavor and nutrition, then boiled again, then fed to the dog who lived outside the door in a snow shelter William had built. Nothing was wasted. Waste was sin in the arithmetic of survival. Every scrap had value, potential use, future purpose. Martha became a miser of food, hoarding and parceling it out with grim determination, knowing that running out meant death, and death was not an option while her children lived. The storm continued. January crawled past, each day a battle against cold and hunger and despair. Food supplies dwindled steadily. By the end of the month, the Ferguson household was eating 2 small meals per day instead of 3. The children's eyes developed the hollow look of inadequate nutrition. Martha's dresses hung loose where they'd once fit snugly. William's belt had to be tightened 2 notches, then 3, but they ate something every day, and they were all still alive. And the cow still gave milk, though less each week, and the fire still burned, and that was enough. It had to be enough, because spring would come eventually. It always came. The question was whether they'd survive long enough to see it, and whether there would be anything left of their lives when it finally arrived. Theodore Roosevelt was not in Dakota Territory when the blizzard struck. He was in New York, warm and comfortable in his sister's house, living the life of an Eastern gentleman which he'd tried so hard to leave behind. But his money was in Dakota. His dreams were in Dakota. And when the reports began filtering east about the catastrophic winter destroying the northern plains, Roosevelt's future was being written in frozen cattle and bankrupt dreams. He'd come to Dakota Territory in 1883, a wealthy young man fleeing personal tragedy. His mother and his wife had died on the same day, in the same house, within hours of each other. The grief had been unbearable, suffocating, And Roosevelt did what men of means often did when Eastern life became too painful. He went west. He invested heavily in cattle ranching, buying into two operations: the Maltese Cross Ranch and the Elkhorn Ranch, both along the Little Missouri River in what would become North Dakota. He'd thrown himself into the work with characteristic energy, trying to become a real Westerner, a real cattleman. He'd learned to ride, to rope, to shoot. He'd earned grudging respect from cowboys who initially mocked his Eastern accent and glasses. Roosevelt loved the West with the passion of a convert. He loved the vast emptiness, the physical challenges, the sense of building something in a hard land. He wrote about it constantly in letters and journals, painting romantic pictures of cowboy life that had more to do with his ideals than reality. His ranches ran cattle on the open range like everyone else. Thousands of head, bought with Eastern money, fattened on free grass, and expected to multiply into a fortune. His partners and employees assured him the investment was sound. Cattle prices were strong. The range could support far more animals than they were running. Winter mortality was minimal in recent years. Roosevelt believed them because he wanted to believe. He needed the West to work, needed it to be the place where he could reinvent himself from grieving widower into rugged frontiersman. The cattle were symbols as much as investments, proof that he belonged in this harsh landscape. When the winter of 1886 to 1887 arrived, Roosevelt was back east, attending to political matters and family obligations. He was aware of the early reports, of harsh weather, but not overly concerned. Winter was always hard in Dakota. His men were experienced. His cattle were hardy. Surely they'd manage as they had in previous years. The first letters from his ranch managers arrived in late January. They were careful, measured, not wanting to alarm their employer prematurely. The weather had been severe, yes. Cattle were, suffering, certainly. But it was too early to assess the full damage. They'd know more in spring when they could ride out and conduct a proper tally. Roosevelt wrote back with questions. How severe? How many cattle were in danger? What measures were being taken to protect the herds? The responses, when they came weeks later, letters delayed by closed roads and disrupted mail service, were progressively more concerning. His ranch, manager at the Maltese Cross, a practical man named Sylvain Ferris, tried to be honest without being devastating. The storms had been worse than anything he'd seen in 20 years on the plains. The cold had been extreme, sustained, deadly. Many cattle were certainly lost. The exact number wouldn't be known until spring roundup. But Ferris estimated at least 30% mortality. Maybe more, 30%. Roosevelt did the math in his study in New York, sitting in a comfortable chair by a warm fire, trying to comprehend what those numbers meant. He owned roughly 5,000 head between his two ranches. 30% meant 1,500 dead cattle. At $40 a head, that was $60,000 lost, more than many men earned in a lifetime. But it was worse than the money. It was the failure of his Western dream. The revelation that the land he'd romanticized could be cruel, that nature didn't care about his needs or desires, that the West wasn't the frontier of opportunity he'd imagined, but a hard country that broke more men than it made. The letters continued through February and into March. Each one was grimmer than the last. 50% losses now estimated, maybe 60. Entire line camps reporting no surviving cattle at all. Fences lined with dead animals piled 3 deep. The Little Missouri River, when it thawed, clogged with carcasses that had to be dynamited free to restore flow. Roosevelt read these letters with growing horror and despair. He'd been so confident, so certain of success. He'd borrowed money, encouraged friends to invest, staked his reputation on the cattle business. And now it was all dying in a winter he wasn't even present to witness. In March, when travel became possible again, Roosevelt received a telegram from Ferris. Brief, direct, devastating. Come west, you need to see this. Roosevelt went. He took the train to Medora, the small town near his ranches, arriving in early April to a world transformed by death. The snow was melting, revealing what had been hidden. And what it revealed was carnage beyond anything he'd prepared himself for. He rode out with Ferris and other ranch hands to assess the damage. Everywhere they looked, cattle. Dead cattle. Frozen cattle. Cattle that had been dead so long the coyotes and wolves had already been at them. Cattle piled against fences. Cattle in ravines. Cattle scattered across the prairie like obscene statues. The smell was overwhelming. Thousands of rotting carcasses perfuming the air with decay. Roosevelt, who'd prided himself on his toughness, on his ability to handle frontier hardships, had to dismount and vomit. He wasn't alone. Even hardened cowboys were sickened by the scale of death. They rode for days, making tally, trying to determine what remained of the herds. Of Roosevelt's 5,000 head, fewer than 2,000 could be found alive. 60% losses. Some of those survivors were in such poor condition they'd likely die anyway. His investment, his dream, reduced by 2/3 in a single winter. The financial blow was severe. Roosevelt had invested approximately $80,000 in his cattle operations. He'd now lost at least $50,000. Maybe more when accounting for lost breeding potential, disrupted operations, and the collapse of cattle prices as the market flooded with emergency sales from desperate ranchers. But Roosevelt was wealthy by birth. His family money cushioned the financial loss. He could absorb $50,000 and remain solvent, which most ranchers could not. What he couldn't absorb as easily was the emotional and philosophical blow. He'd come west believing in self-reliance, in the nobility of honest labor, in the frontier as a proving ground for American character. The Great Die-Up revealed those beliefs as naive. Self-reliance meant nothing when nature decided to kill everything. Honest labor couldn't prevent disaster driven by forces beyond human control. The frontier proved nothing except that it could kill you regardless of your character. Roosevelt spent several weeks at his ranches that spring, helping with the cleanup, the salvage operations, the grim work of trying to build something from the ruins. He participated in roundups, searching for surviving cattle, trying to assess what could be rebuilt. At night, he slept in the cabin at the Maltese Cross Ranch, the same cabin where his cowboys had weathered the storm. The bunks were still there, the stove, the smoke-stained walls. He'd slept here before on previous visits, treating it as an adventure, roughing it among the men. Now he slept in those bunks, knowing what they'd endured, what this room had protected them from. The cabin was small, cramped, cold even in April. Roosevelt lay on a rope bunk under wool blankets that smelled of smoke and men, and tried to imagine what January had been like. The wind screaming outside, the cold pressing in from all sides, the sound of cattle dying in the darkness, the knowledge that your livelihood, your future, everything you'd worked for was ending, and there was nothing you could do. He couldn't fully imagine it. He'd missed the actual storm, been warm and safe in New York while his employees fought for survival. That distance, that absence, haunted him. He'd been the investor, the gentleman rancher playing at being a cowboy. When it mattered, when the real test came, he hadn't been there. This realization changed him. Not immediately, not in one dramatic moment, but gradually over the following months and years. The West was no longer a romantic escape. It was a hard place where hard things happened, where nature was indifferent to human suffering, where the rules that governed Eastern society didn't apply. This understanding would shape his later conservation work. As president, Roosevelt would set aside millions of acres as national forests and parks, would push for scientific management of natural resources, would argue that the West's resources weren't infinite and needed protection. The cattle disaster of 1887 was the seed of that understanding. But in the spring of 1887, Roosevelt was just a wealthy young man surveying the wreckage of his dreams. He walked among the dead cattle, rode across ranges that should have been covered with livestock but were eerily empty, and made calculations about what could be salvaged. His ranch managers were exhausted, traumatized by the winter they'd survived. Roosevelt listened to their stories with growing respect. These men had faced conditions he'd only read about and emerged alive, if not unscathed. Ferris told him about nights when they weren't sure the bunkhouse would stand, about mornings when they'd wake to find new snow drifted inside through the cracks, about the constant work of keeping fires burning, of rationing food, of listening to cattle die and being unable to help. Roosevelt paid his men bonuses, unexpected and generous, acknowledging what they'd endured. It was the least he could do, given that he'd been warm and safe while they'd nearly frozen. He also made a decision. He would not abandon his Dakota ranches entirely, but he would not rebuild to previous scale. The open range era was over. The land couldn't support the numbers they'd run. The climate was too unpredictable, the investment too risky. He kept the Elkhorn Ranch as a retreat, a place he could visit and remember why he'd come west in the first place. But the cattle operation was downsized dramatically. A few hundred head, manageable, with hay put up for winter feeding. A sensible operation rather than a grand adventure. The Maltese Cross was eventually sold. Too many bad memories. Too much money lost. Roosevelt needed to move forward, and that meant leaving behind the ranch that had represented such hope and ended in such disaster. In his autobiography, written years later, Roosevelt would describe the winter of 1886 to 1887 as a necessary education. The romantic had been burned away, leaving behind a more realistic understanding of nature and human limitations. The winter had killed his cattle and his illusions simultaneously, but he rarely spoke about what his employees endured. Their stories weren't his to tell, and he knew his own experience, arriving after the worst had passed, was nothing compared to theirs. He'd lost money. They'd nearly lost their lives. One story stayed with him, though, told by a cowboy at the Maltese Cross. During the worst of the storm, this cowboy had volunteered to check on a nearby line camp, worried about the two men stationed there. He'd ridden out with a rope tied around his waist, the other end tied to the bunkhouse, planning to follow the rope back if he got disoriented. The temperature was 50 below with howling wind. He'd made it half a mile before he couldn't feel his hands or feet, before the cold had penetrated so deeply he knew he was in danger of freezing. He'd turned back, following the rope, barely making it to the bunkhouse before collapsing. The two men at the line camp were found dead when spring came. They'd tried to wait out the storm, ran out of firewood, and froze in their bunks. The cowboy who'd tried to reach them carried guilt about that for the rest of his life, even though there was nothing he could have done. Roosevelt listened to this story and understood, perhaps for the first time, what winter on the frontier really meant. Sleep in Dakota, he realized, was a gift not to be taken for granted. Every night his men had survived was a victory against odds that should have killed them, and every morning they'd woken was a reminder that survival wasn't guaranteed, that warmth and shelter and life itself were temporary conditions that could end at any moment. Roosevelt returned east that spring, his Western adventure permanently altered. He would continue to love the West, would continue to visit and hunt and write about it. But he would never again be naive about its harshness. The winter of 1887 had taught him that nature didn't care about your dreams, your money, or your character. It simply existed, indifferent, and you survived or you didn't. His cattle were mostly dead. His investment was lost, but he was alive, and his employees were alive, and that had to be enough. January ended, but the storm did not. February arrived with no fanfare, no change, just another day of grey sky and screaming wind and cold that wouldn't break. People stopped marking days on calendars. Time lost meaning when every day was identical. An endless repetition of surviving until dark, surviving through dark, waking to survive again. The psychological weight of the storm's duration became as dangerous as the physical cold. Humans are resilient, but not infinitely so. We can endure terrible conditions if we believe they'll end. But when days stretch into weeks, weeks stretch toward months, and conditions remain unchanged, the mind begins to fracture in subtle ways. In the Ferguson household, the children grew quieter. They'd stopped asking when the storm would end. They'd stopped asking much of anything. They sat by the fire, conserving energy. their eyes following their mother's movements with an intensity that unnerved her. They were always hungry now, and the hunger made them old beyond their years. Martha found herself forgetting things. She'd go to the cold bedroom to fetch something and stand there, shivering, unable to remember what she'd come for. She'd start sentences and lose the thread midway, words dissolving like snow on her tongue. William said her name sometimes, and she wouldn't hear him, lost in thoughts that circled endlessly around food, fire, survival. William stopped shaving. There was no point. No one to see him except his family, and vanity seemed absurd when survival was uncertain. His beard grew thick and unkempt, ice forming in it every time he went outside to milk the cow or fetch wood. He'd come back in looking, like a wild man, and the children would stare at him until Martha made them look away. The cow's milk production had dropped to less than a quart per day. The animal was suffering from cold and inadequate feed, standing in the barn with her ribs visible through her hide. William knew they should slaughter her, use the meat, but the milk was too precious. As long as she gave any milk at all, he'd keep making that twice-daily journey to the barn. Sleep patterns disintegrated completely. There was no day or night anymore, just periods of lighter grey and darker grey outside the oiled paper window. People slept when exhaustion overwhelmed them, woke when cold or hunger or nightmares forced consciousness. The family's sleeping pile shifted constantly as people moved, trying to find warmth, trying to escape dreams. Martha's dreams were always about food, elaborate meals from her childhood in Wisconsin. Her mother's kitchen, warm and fragrant, tables loaded with roasted chicken and potatoes and fresh bread and butter. She'd wake with saliva flooding her mouth, stomach cramping with want. The disappointment of reality crushing. They had beans, always beans, the same beans cooked the same way, day after day, until the thought of eating another spoonful made her gag. William dreamed about summer, riding across green ranges, cattle fat and healthy, sun warm on his shoulders. He'd wake disoriented, expecting heat, finding only cold. The contrast between dream and reality was so sharp it hurt physically. His chest would ache. His throat would close. He'd lie there fighting tears while his family slept around him. The children's dreams were less specific, but more unsettling. They'd whimper in their sleep, reach out for comfort, wake crying without being able to say why. Emma, the youngest, stopped sleeping deeply at all. She'd doze in fits and starts, never truly relaxing, her small body tense even in sleep. The storm broke briefly in early February. For 3 days the wind dropped to a whisper, the snow stopped falling, and temperature rose to just below freezing. Clouds remained, but didn't seem as oppressive. The change felt miraculous after weeks of unrelenting assault. William ventured outside beyond the barn for the first time since January. The landscape was unrecognizable. Snow had sculpted itself into bizarre formations, drifts 20 feet high in some places, bare ground in others. The fence line he'd built 2 summers ago was completely buried. Only the tops of fence posts showed, wooden fingers pointing at the grey sky. He walked out across what had been their pasture, breaking through crusted snow with each step. The snow held his weight for a moment, then collapsed, dropping him thigh-deep into soft powder beneath. It was exhausting to move, each step a battle, but he kept going, desperate for space, for distance from the cabin that had become their prison. He found a dead cow half buried in a drift. One of their small herd, frozen solid, the hide pulled, tight over protruding bones. He stood looking at it for a long time, feeling nothing. He was too tired for grief. The cow was dead. More would be dead. Everything might be dead. These were just facts now, beyond emotion. When he returned to the cabin, Martha and the children were standing in the doorway, watching him. They looked like ghosts in the grey light, pale and thin and insubstantial. He realized he probably looked the same to them. That night the Chinook wind arrived, warm wind from the southwest, carrying temperature up 30 degrees in 2 hours. It felt like a gift from God, a promise that winter could end, that warmth still existed somewhere in the world. People opened doors and windows despite the waste, of heat from their fires, desperate for fresh air, for the feeling of movement, for anything different. The warm wind melted the top layer of snow, water dripped from roofs, ran in small streams across frozen ground, pooled in low spots. For brief hours, it seemed like spring might actually come, that the nightmare might be ending, but the Chinook betrayed them. After 2 days of relative warmth, the wind shifted back to the north. Temperature plummeted. The water that had melted froze instantly, creating a thick crust of ice over everything. The snow that had softened turned to concrete, and when more snow fell on top of that ice, it created a prison for any surviving cattle. Before the Chinook, cattle could at least paw through snow to reach grass beneath. After the ice crust formed, this became impossible. Their hooves couldn't break through. They stood on top of their food, separated from it by inches of ice, and slowly starved, while the grass they needed lay tantalizingly close. Cowboys trapped in bunkhouses understood what this meant. Any cattle that had survived. January were now doomed. The Chinook hadn't been salvation. It had been a final cruelty, raising hope before delivering death more certainly than the cold alone could have. In the bunkhouses, men stopped talking about spring. They stopped talking much at all. Conversation required energy they didn't have. They lay in their bunks, wrapped in blankets, emerging only to eat the meager meals old Pete still managed to prepare, or to take their turns feeding the stove. The silence was worse than the earlier noise of men talking and joking and trying to maintain morale. Silence meant defeat. Silence meant they'd accepted that this was how things were now, that normal life was so far away it might as well not exist. Some men slept 20 hours a day. Their bodies had adapted to scarcity by shutting down, reducing all functions to bare minimum. They moved slowly when they moved at all, speaking in monosyllables, their eyes dull and unfocused. They weren't sick, exactly. They were hibernating, human versions of bears in dens, waiting for conditions to improve. Others couldn't sleep at all, too anxious, too frightened, too aware of their situation. They'd lie awake hour after hour, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind that never stopped. Their eyes developed a particular look, wide and staring, ringed with dark circles. Their hands shook constantly. They jumped at sudden sounds. Old Pete worried about these wakeful men more than the sleeping ones. The sleepers were conserving energy, doing what their bodies told them to do. But the wakeful men were burning through resources they couldn't afford to lose. Their minds were eating themselves from the inside, consuming sanity the way their bodies were consuming stored fat. He tried to help in small ways. Extra coffee for the wakeful ones, bitter and hot, and something to focus on besides fear. Stories told quietly in the dark, anything to distract. Sometimes just sitting with them, 2 men awake in a room full of sleeping men, sharing the burden of consciousness. The nights were hardest. 15, 16 hours of darkness in February's depth. The stove provided light as well as heat, flames visible through gaps in the iron, but it was barely enough to see by. Men moved through darkness, feeling their way, bumping into bunks and each other. Without clocks, without daylight, time became abstract. You'd wake, if you could call it waking when you'd only been half asleep, and have no idea if you'd been unconscious for 10 minutes or 10 hours. The disorientation was profound. Some men stopped trying to track time at all. They ate when food appeared, slept when they couldn't stay awake, existed in a perpetual present with no past or future. The concept of sleep itself changed. It wasn't restful anymore. You didn't sleep to feel refreshed. You slept because consciousness was too expensive to maintain. Sleep was a small death you practiced nightly, preparing for the real death that might come if the storm continued much longer. Dreams during this period took on a hallucinatory quality. Men dreamed they were awake, walking around the bunkhouse, having conversations with others, only to actually wake and realize none of it had been real. Or they'd dream they were outside in the storm, freezing, struggling towards shelter, and wake to find themselves wrapped in blankets by the stove. The boundary between sleeping and waking blurred. Some men experienced what would now be called dissociation. They'd observe themselves from outside their bodies, watching a stranger wear their clothes and speak with their voice. This disconnection was protective, a way the mind created distance from unbearable circumstances. But it was also terrifying to lose even the certainty of being yourself. In the ranch houses, children handled the extended ordeal better than adults in some ways. They adapted, accepting the new reality more easily than their parents who remembered how things should be. To the children, this was simply how life was now, cold, hungry, confined, but normal within its own context. But they also suffered in ways adults didn't. Their growing bodies needed more food than they were getting. Their development was being stunted by malnutrition. Sarah Ferguson, 11 years old, stopped growing taller. Her monthly bleeding, which had just started that fall, stopped entirely. Her body shut down non-essential functions to preserve life. Thomas developed a cough that wouldn't go away, a deep rattling in his chest that scared Martha. She'd give him extra portions of the thin soup she made, sacrificing from her own bowl, but it didn't help much. The cough persisted, worsening at night, keeping him and everyone else awake. James, 7 years old, stopped talking almost entirely. He'd answer questions with nods or shakes of his head, but volunteered nothing. He'd sit for hours staring at the fire, his face expressionless. Martha worried about him most of all, this strange, silent child who'd been so vibrant just months. Emma, the baby, clung to her mother constantly. She'd scream if Martha tried to put her down, terrified of separation. Martha learned to do everything one-handed, cooking, cleaning, even sleeping with the child attached to her like a growth. It was exhausting, but she understood. Emma was reverting to infancy, seeking the safety of the womb in a world that had become too frightening. February crawled past with the weight of years. Each day was a week long. Each week felt like a month. People stopped believing in spring. Spring was a myth, a story told by liars. There was only winter, eternal winter, and the question was no longer when it would end, but whether you'd survive it. And still the wind blew, and still the cold pressed in, and still people slept fitfully in their prisons of wood and hope, waiting for deliverance that seemed less likely with each passing day. Children experienced the great die-up through a lens of confusion and adaptation that was both heartbreaking and remarkable. They didn't fully understand what was happening or why, but they adjusted to impossibility with a flexibility adults had lost. To them, the storm wasn't an economic disaster or a failure of planning. It was simply the way the world had become, and they learned to live in it. Sarah Ferguson, at 11, was old enough to sense her parents' fear, even when they tried to hide it. She watched her mother's hands shake when portioning out food. She noticed her father's long silences, the way he'd stare at the fire without seeing it. She understood, in a way her younger siblings didn't, that something was terribly wrong. This knowledge was a burden. She couldn't share it with Thomas or James or Emma because they were too young to understand, and speaking it aloud would make it more real. So she carried it silently, trying to help without being asked, watching for ways to ease the tension that filled the cabin like smoke. She learned to anticipate her mother's needs. When Martha reached for the water bucket, Sarah was already moving, to refill it with snow. When the fire burned low, Sarah added wood before being told. She took charge of Emma when the toddler grew fussy, singing to her, telling her stories, anything to give Martha a few minutes of peace. At night, Sarah lay awake, listening to her siblings breathe, counting breaths, making sure everyone was still, alive. She'd developed an irrational fear that someone would simply stop breathing in the dark and no one would notice. So she stayed vigilant, even when her own body screamed for sleep. She dreamed about school, which seemed like something from another life. the one-room schoolhouse 3 miles from their ranch, where Miss Peterson taught reading and arithmetic to a dozen farm children. Sarah had loved school, loved learning, loved having somewhere to go that wasn't the ranch. The storm had started during Christmas break, and school hadn't reopened. Might never reopen if families didn't survive the winter. She wondered about her classmates. Were they trapped in their homes too? Were they hungry? Were they scared? Or had some of them already died, frozen in cabins that couldn't keep them warm, and she'd never know because news didn't travel through blizzards? These thoughts circled in her head at night, keeping her awake even when exhaustion made her bones ache. She was becoming an adult too quickly, forced to carry worries that children shouldn't have to carry. But she had no choice. The storm didn't care about childhood innocence. Thomas, at 9, dealt with the storm differently. He grew angry. Not explosive anger, not tantrums, but a cold, sullen fury that he directed at everything and nothing. He was angry at the wind for not stopping, angry at his father for not fixing things, angry at God for letting this happen, angry at himself for being trapped and helpless. He'd punch his thin straw mattress when no one was looking, imagining it was the storm, hitting it until his knuckles hurt. He'd kick at the wall, leaving small scuff marks that his mother saw but didn't comment on. He needed to fight something, but there was nothing to fight except weather, and weather was beyond fighting. At night, Thomas didn't sleep so much as surrender. He'd fight consciousness until his body simply shut down, crashing into sleep so deep it was almost like fainting. He'd wake suddenly, disoriented, not remembering where he was for terrifying seconds before memory returned and reality settled back into place. His dreams were violent. He fought bears, wolves, faceless men. He swung fists and weapons, defending his family against threats that dissolved when he tried to focus on them. He'd wake with his heart pounding, sweat soaking his collar despite the cold, and lie there, trying to calm down before he disturbed everyone else. He was hungry all the time, a gnawing, constant hunger that made him think about food obsessively. He'd remember meals from before the storm, special occasions when they'd had roasted chicken, or beef, or his mother's apple pie. The memories were so vivid he could taste them, and the disappointment when he opened his eyes to find only reality was crushing. His mother noticed his anger, but didn't know how to help. She'd try to hug him, and he'd tolerate it stiffly, uncomfortable, with comfort, needing to be tough. He was the man of the house when his father was outside. He had to be strong. He couldn't let himself be a child, even though he was desperately, urgently still a child who needed reassurance that everything would be all right. James, at 7, retreated into silence and fantasy. He created elaborate stories in his head, imagining himself as a hero who could control weather, who could make the sun come out and melt all the snow. In his fantasies, he'd save his family, save the cattle, save everyone. People would thank him. His father would be proud. These daydreams occupied hours. He'd sit by the fire, face blank, living entirely in his imagination where he was powerful instead of helpless. His mother worried about his silence, not understanding it was protection. If he didn't talk, he didn't have to acknowledge reality. He could stay in his head where things made sense and he had control. At night, James slept deeply but unrestfully. He'd thrash and kick, fighting battles in his dreams, sometimes crying out words no one could understand. His siblings had learned to sleep away from his feet because he'd kick without waking. Martha would sometimes reach over and touch his forehead, checking for fever, but he was just hot from the exertion of his dreams. When he did talk, it was often about summer. He'd ask when they could go outside and play, when they could go fishing in the creek, when the cattle would come back. His questions broke Martha's heart because she had no answers. She'd deflect, saying soon, or when winter ends, knowing these were lies, but unable to tell a 7-year-old that winter might not end, that nothing might come back. Emma, just 3 years old, understood least and suffered most in some ways. She knew something was wrong but couldn't articulate what. Her world had shrunk to one room, a fire, and the immediate presence of her family. She didn't remember clearly how things had been before the storm. This cold, confined existence was becoming her normal. She cried often, not from any specific pain, but from generalized distress. Hungry cries, cold cries, tired cries, scared cries. Her vocabulary wasn't sufficient to express what she felt, so she cried and clung to her mother and refused to be put down. Martha carried her constantly, the child's weight a familiar burden. Emma was getting lighter instead of heavier, losing weight she couldn't afford to lose. Her ribs showed through her thin dress. Her eyes seemed too large for her face. She looked like children in pictures of famine, skeletal and haunted. At night, Emma slept fitfully, waking every few hours crying for her mother even though Martha was right there. She'd need to be held, rocked, soothed back to sleep, a process that took longer each time. Martha would hold her daughter and feel the tiny heart beating too fast, the small body too hot one moment and too cold the next, and wonder if Emma would survive even if the storm ended. Emma's dreams, when she could describe them in her limited vocabulary, were simple and sad. She dreamed of being warm, of having enough to eat, of going outside to play. She dreamed of summer in fragments, sensory impressions rather than coherent narratives. Sun on her face, grass under her feet, the feeling of running without being cold. The children had created small rituals to mark time and maintain some structure. Every morning, however they defined morning, Sarah would lead them in a counting game. They'd count to 100 together, which took Emma's entire concentration and distracted her from crying. Then they'd count by twos, by fives, by tens, math as comfort, numbers as proof that some things remained stable. In the afternoon, Thomas would tell stories. He'd inherited his father's storytelling ability and would spin tales about cowboys and cattle drives and adventures that took place in summer warmth. His siblings would listen, transported briefly to worlds where people weren't trapped and cold and hungry. Emma had a doll, a simple thing made from rags stuffed with more rags, with button eyes and yarn hair. She carried it everywhere, talking to it in her baby voice, explaining things. The doll was hungry. The doll was cold. The doll wanted mama. Through the doll, Emma processed her own feelings, giving voice to fears she couldn't express directly, the EE. Children learn to read their parents' moods and adjust their behavior accordingly. When Martha looked particularly strained, they'd be quieter, more cooperative. When William came in from the barn looking defeated, they'd give him space, not asking for attention he couldn't provide. They became expert at making themselves small, at not adding to the household's burdens. But they were still children, and children need play. They'd create games from nothing, counting cracks in the ceiling, making shadow figures on the wall with their hands when the fire was bright enough, building towers from the few wooden blocks they owned, then knocking them down and building again. Sarah taught Emma songs, the same songs their mother had taught her. Simple rhymes about animals and weather and daily life. Emma's favorite was about a bird that flew south for winter, which seemed especially relevant. She'd sing it over and over, the words slurring together, while her siblings tried not to show their irritation. The children also absorbed lessons they shouldn't have needed to learn so young. That food was precious and must never be wasted. That fire was life and must be watched constantly. That cold could kill and must be respected. That sometimes adults didn't have answers, didn't know what to do, were as frightened and helpless as children, but had to pretend otherwise. They learned what their parents looked like when pretending to be brave, the slight tremor in their mother's voice when she said everything would be fine, the way their father's smile didn't reach his eyes. They learned to accept these performances without comment, understanding that challenging them would make things worse. In later years, the Ferguson children would remember the winter of 1887 as a blur. They'd recall specific images. The fire, always the fire, and their mother's face in its light. and the sound of wind that never stopped. But the timeline would be confused, events blending together because days had no distinct markers. Sarah would remember being hungry but never being fed. Thomas would remember being angry but not knowing why. James would remember his fantasy world more clearly than reality, which was probably for the best. Emma would remember almost nothing directly, just a vague sense of having been cold once, long ago, for longer than seemed possible. But they'd also remember warmth of a different kind. The feeling of sleeping piled together, siblings in a heap like puppies, their mother's songs in the dark, their father's hands, rough and gentle, checking them for frostbite. The way Sarah would hold Emma when Emma cried. The way Thomas would share his tiny portion of food, even though he was starving. The way James would tell stories that made them laugh despite everything. Children are resilient, but resilience has costs. The Ferguson children survived the winter, but they were changed. Sarah grew old before her time, burdened with worries she couldn't set down. Thomas's anger would last years, manifesting in ways that troubled his parents. James would remain in fantasy longer than he should, reluctant to engage with a world that had proven so harsh. Emma would be clingy and fearful, suffering from what we'd now call anxiety, though no one had that word then. But they survived. All 4 Ferguson children made it through the winter alive, which many children didn't. In the spring, when Sarah returned to school, half her classmates were missing, died in the storm, or their families had moved away, or they were too weak to attend. The teacher never spoke about them, and Sarah never asked, but she noticed the empty desks and understood what they meant. The children's winter was its own story within the larger tragedy. They experienced the same cold, the same hunger, the same confinement as adults, but they experienced it through the lens of childhood, with less understanding but also with adaptability adults couldn't match. They bent instead of breaking, or at least bent further before breaking, and some of them survived precisely because they were young enough to accept the impossible and adapt to it. March came quietly, without announcement or ceremony. The wind didn't stop all at once. The cold didn't break dramatically. But sometime in the first week of March, people noticed the light had changed. The grey wasn't quite as oppressive. The sun, invisible for months behind clouds, occasionally created a bright spot in the overcast sky, a suggestion that it still existed somewhere beyond the grey. The temperature rose first, not to warmth, not even close, but up from the deadly negatives, into the teens, then the 20s. At 20 degrees, after months of temperatures well below zero, it felt almost tropical. William Ferguson stepped outside without his heaviest coat for the first time since January and felt the difference immediately. Still cold, but survivable cold. Manageable cold. Human cold. The wind dropped next. Not gone, but diminished from its constant shriek to something closer to a whisper. You could hear other sounds again. Birds, tentatively returning. The creak of the barn, your own footsteps in the snow. After months of wind that drowned out everything, the relative silence was disorienting, and then finally the snow stopped falling. Days passed without new accumulation. The sky remained cloudy, but the clouds weren't releasing their burden anymore. What was on the ground would stay on the ground, but nothing new was coming. This realization spread through trapped households, like a physical wave. The storm was ending. Winter was releasing its grip. Spring, impossible spring, was actually going to come. But the thaw revealed horrors that had been hidden under snow. As temperatures rose above freezing and snow began to melt, the dead emerged. Cattle everywhere. More cattle than anyone had imagined possible. They lay along fence lines, stacked 3 and 4 deep, where they'd crowded against barriers trying to escape the wind. They filled ravines, hundreds in a single coulee, frozen together into a grotesque mass. They lined riverbanks, piled where they'd sought water, and found ice instead. William rode out in mid-March to assess their losses. The snow had melted enough to navigate. though the ground was a swamp of mud and standing water. He rode for hours, seeing nothing but dead cattle. Their small herd of 30 head was gone. All 30 dead. Some near the barn where they'd sought shelter. Others scattered across their range, frozen in place, some still standing. The smell was overwhelming. As the carcasses thawed, they began to rot. The air across the plains filled with the sweet, cloying stench of decay. You couldn't escape it. It permeated clothing, hair, got into your mouth and nose until you tasted it constantly. Cowboys tied, scarves soaked in vinegar over their faces, but it barely helped. The financial devastation was absolute. Ranches that had run thousands of head found hundreds alive, if that. The great cattle companies, backed by Eastern and European money, went bankrupt overnight. Investors who'd expected returns of 20–30% instead lost everything. The boom was over. The cattle kingdom had fallen. But more important than money, more immediate, was the human cost. As spring progressed and travel became possible again, stories emerged. A family in Wyoming had burned their furniture for fuel, then their floorboards, then had frozen to death anyway. A cowboy in Montana had tried to reach town for supplies, got lost in a storm, and was found frozen solid sitting upright on his horse, both man and animal dead. Children died quietly in their sleep, their small bodies unable to maintain heat. Old people died the same way, peaceful endings to hard lives. Young men died trying to help, venturing out into storms to check on neighbors or cattle, never making it back. Women died in childbirth in cabins where no help could reach them. Babies dying with their mothers. The death toll among cattle was calculable, measurable, shocking in its enormity. Estimates ranged from 60 to 90% mortality across the northern plains. Hundreds of thousands of animals dead. But the human toll was harder to count. People died alone in isolated cabins, their bodies not discovered until spring. Whole families vanished. Homesteads found empty when the snow cleared. No trace of where the occupants had gone, or whether they'd survived. Theodore Roosevelt returned to his ransacked ranches and surveyed the ruin of his Western dreams. Cowboys, who'd barely survived, told stories of unimaginable hardship. Ranchers calculated losses that dwarfed their ability to recover. And slowly, painfully, everyone who'd survived began the work of rebuilding. But they rebuilt differently. The open range was dead, killed as surely as the cattle that had grazed it. Ranchers who continued in the business built barns, stored hay, kept smaller herds they could actually feed through winter. They fenced pastures, rotating cattle seasonally rather than letting them roam year-round. The cowboy, as romantic figure, driving vast herds across unfenced prairie, became a relic of a past that had ended in ice and death. The survivors were changed. Martha Ferguson emerged from that winter 20 pounds lighter, her hair gone grey at 32. William's hands shook for months afterward, trauma expressing itself in tremors he couldn't control. The children carried scars that wouldn't show. For years, psychological wounds that would shape their entire lives, but they'd survived. All of them. The Ferguson family made it through intact, which was more than many could say. And as spring truly arrived, as green grass pushed up through mud and trees began to bud and the sun returned with actual warmth, they began to remember what life could be. The first night Martha slept without waking every few hours, checking on her children. She woke feeling guilty for having rested. The first morning, William went outside and wasn't hit by killing cold. He stood in the barn doorway and cried. The children, resilient as children are, adapted more quickly. They ran outside in bare feet, feeling grass beneath their toes, relearning, joy they'd almost forgotten. Sleep in spring was different from sleep in winter. The fear was gone, the vigilance unnecessary. People slept deeply for the first time in months, their bodies finally feeling safe enough to truly rest. They slept for 10 hours, 12 hours, catching up on sleep debt accumulated over winter. They woke refreshed, amazed at the feeling, remembering what normal had felt like. But the dreams remained. For years afterward, survivors would wake from nightmares about the winter of 1887. They'd dream of being trapped, of being cold, of hearing cattle die, and being unable to help. These dreams would fade over time, but never entirely disappear. The winter had carved itself into their psyches, a permanent scar. And now, dear traveller through this story, we've reached the end of our journey through the coldest winter in wild West history. We've walked with cowboys in their bunkhouses, huddled with families around failing fires, witnessed the death of cattle and dreams, and an entire way of life. The Great Die-Up of 1887 was catastrophic. It killed hundreds of thousands of animals, bankrupted fortunes, and ended the era of open-range ranching forever. But more than that, it tested human endurance in ways few events ever have. It asked people to survive the unsurvivable, to sleep, in conditions where sleep seemed impossible, to maintain hope when hope was absurd, and they did. Not all of them, not even most of them without terrible cost, but enough survived to tell the story, to rebuild, to ensure that the lessons learned would protect future generations. As you lie in your warm bed tonight, safe from cold and storm, let yourself feel the profound gift of that warmth. The pioneers of the Wild West would have considered your comfort miraculous, impossible luxury beyond imagining. Central heating, insulated walls, blankets made in factories rather than woven by hand. You live in the future they could only dream of, the safety they fought to reach. Their struggle made this possible. Every improvement in building techniques, every advance in weather prediction, every system we have now to survive winter grew from lessons learned in disasters like the Great Die-Up. They suffered so that eventually people wouldn't have to suffer, so that sleep could be restful rather than survival, so that winter could be endured without terror. Let their memory settle over you gently now. Let the wind that screamed across the Montana plains become the whisper of your fan. Let the cold that killed become the pleasant coolness of your air conditioning. Let the hunger that gnawed at them become the satisfaction of knowing you can eat when you wake. You are safe, you are warm, you are comfortable in ways they couldn't have imagined. And as you drift towards sleep, carry with you gratitude for that safety. Honor their endurance by appreciating what you have. Remember their suffering by cherishing your comfort. The winter of 1887 is over. It has been over for more than a century, but its story remains, a testament to human resilience and the terrible power of nature. The cowboys and ranchers and children who lived through it are long gone, but their experience echoes forward to us, teaching us about survival, about courage, about the precious gift of a warm place to sleep. So sleep now, deeply and peacefully. Let the weight of blankets comfort rather than burden you. Let the darkness be restful rather than fearful. Let your dreams be gentle rather than haunted. The storm has passed. Spring has come. The long winter night is over, and you, in your warm bed, in your safe room, can rest without fear, can close your eyes without vigilance, can surrender to sleep, knowing you'll wake to warmth and safety. The Great Die-Up claimed so much, so many cattle, so many dreams, so much hope. But it couldn't claim everything. It couldn't kill the human capacity to endure, to adapt, to survive impossible conditions, and emerge, if not unscathed, then at least alive. Still capable of love, still capable of rebuilding, still capable of hope. That resilience lives in you too. You carry it in your genes, inherited from ancestors who survived winters and storms and hardships we can barely imagine. Their strength is your strength. Their determination is your determination. Their ability to close their eyes in terrible circumstances and wait to face another day is yours as well. You don't need it tonight. Tonight, you can simply rest. Let the story of the Great Die-Up fade like snow melting in spring sun. Let the cold recede. Let warmth embrace you completely. Sleep well, knowing that winter always ends, that spring always comes, that the coldest night eventually gives way to dawn. The pioneers of 1887 learned this truth at terrible cost. But they learned it, and they survived. And because of them, you live in a world where winter is manageable, where cold is temporary, where sleep is safe. Close your eyes now. Let your breathing slow. Feel the weight of your body sink into your mattress, supported and comfortable. You've traveled a long way tonight, through a winter that ended before you were born. You've witnessed suffering and endurance and the slow arrival of relief. Now it's time to find your own relief, your own rest, your own peaceful surrender to sleep. The wind has stopped screaming. The cold has lost its teeth. The cattle are grazing on green grass in valleys where snow once piled 20 feet deep. And you are here, warm and safe, ready to sleep, ready to dream gentle dreams, ready to wake refreshed to a world where the great die-up is history, where winter is a season rather than a death sentence, where sleep is rest rather than survival. Good night, traveller. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the coldest winter in Wild West history. May your own sleep be everything those pioneers couldn't have. May you wake warm and safe, grateful for the comfort that cost them so much to achieve. The storm is over. Spring has come. Sleep well.
Good evening and welcome back, friends. Tonight, we are going to journey through the Great Famine Winter, when medieval Europe froze for 7 years. As always, let me know where in the world you are listening in from. Get cozy, settle in, and let's begin. In the spring of 1315, a mother in northern England made an unthinkable decision. She locked her children inside their cottage, walked into the frozen wasteland, and never returned. But she wasn't abandoning them. She was saving them. Was she? Knew what all of Europe would soon discover was that the world itself was dying. The rain wouldn't stop. The cold wouldn't break. And for the next 7 years, winter would reign supreme. Her name was Marjorie of Durham, and her neighbors found her children 3 days later, alive, huddled around the last embers of their fire. The eldest, a boy of 9, clutched a note his mother had left. The priest who recorded it wrote that his hands shook as he read her words aloud. My flesh will buy them grain. My absence will grant them mercy. Tell them I walk toward God, not away from them. You see, Marjorie had understood something terrible. Something that would take the rest of Europe months to grasp. This wasn't just another harsh spring. This was the beginning of an extinction. The marketplace where she'd traded her body for bread had made the calculation clear. A living mother meant 5 mouths to feed. A missing mother meant for orphans. The church had to shelter, and the church still had grain, still had walls, still had hope that this nightmare would end. But here's what makes Marjorie's story so haunting. She wasn't unique. Parish records from 1315 show hundreds of similar disappearances. Parents vanishing into blizzards, elderly grandparents wandering into forests, always leaving notes, always locking doors from the outside, always walking toward death like it was salvation. The chronicler Geoffrey Le Baker would later write about that spring with words that feel pulled from nightmares. Rains began on St. George's Day and fell like God had forgotten how to do anything else. Not the warm rains of April that wake sleeping seeds, but frozen needles that killed whatever they touched. Crops didn't fail, they drowned standing. Rivers didn't flood, they exploded from their banks like wounded animals. Think about that. For a moment, you're a medieval peasant. Your entire world is 3 miles wide. Everything you know about survival, every technique your father taught you, every prayer your mother whispered, assumes one simple truth, that seasons follow patterns. Spring brings life, summer brings growth, autumn brings harvest, winter brings rest. But what happens when spring never comes? When winter refuses to die? When the very foundation of existence cracks beneath your feet? That's what began in 1315. Not a famine, not a crisis, but the complete collapse of natural order. And Marjorie of Durham, walking into that frozen dawn, leaving her children behind to live, was just the first character in a story that would consume 15 million souls. Before it ended. The question isn't how Europe survived, it's what Europe became to survive it. Picture yourself waking up on Easter morning, 1315, in a small village outside Paris. Your neighbor Johannes jokes about yesterday's rain ruining his seedlings. His wife laughs, saying one wet spring never hurt anyone. Within 6 months, Johannes will trade his youngest daughter for a bag of moldy grain. His wife will disappear one night, and the village will pretend not to notice the fresh meat at the butcher's stall. But this morning, they're still laughing. The peculiar thing about catastrophe is how quietly it arrives. No trumpets, no divine warnings, just rain. Endless, crushing, biblical rain that began falling across Europe in May 1315 and simply didn't stop. That Easter morning in Kratzy-le-Chapelle, 20 miles from Paris, felt like any other. The baker Michel had risen at cockscrow to fire his ovens. His wife Agnes counted their silver, planning to buy young pigs at the summer fair. Their son Pierre played with wooden knights, recreating battles he'd never fight because there wouldn't be a world left to fight for. The church bells summoned them to Mass. Father Bernard, still young enough to believe suffering had meaning, delivered a sermon about resurrection, about new life, about God's promise that seed time and harvest would never cease. The congregation nodded along, comfortable in their certainty. Why wouldn't they be? Their grandfathers had survived wars. Their fathers had survived plagues. Surely they could survive a little rain. But if you'd looked carefully that morning really, Latude have seen the signs. The sparrows that usually nested in the church eaves were gone. Not dead, gone. The cats had stopped hunting, instead huddling in doorways with their fur perpetually damp. And the old women, the ones who remembered the harsh winter of 1258, had started hoarding soldat. Johannes, the man who joked about his seedlings, was a cloth merchant. Successful enough to own 2 cows and rent 3 strips of land. His wife Marie had borne him 7 children, 4 still living, which made them lucky by medieval standards. Their youngest, Isabel, had just turned 6, hair like spun gold. Her father would say, worth its weight in gold, someone else would say 6 months later, weighing her against a sack of spoiled wheat. The rain that Easter was unusual only in its persistence. It had fallen for 3 days straight, turning the roads to mud, keeping the holiday merchants away. But rain in April wasn't catastrophe, it was inconvenience. The real terror wouldn't begin until May 15th, the feast of St. Dymphna, when the rain turned cold. Brother Francis of the Abbey St. Denis recorded it first. He'd been copying manuscripts when he noticed his breath misting in the scriptorium. In May, at midday, the ink froze on his quill. He thought perhaps illness had taken him. Fever turned backward into chills. Then he saw the other monks rubbing their hands, saw the frost forming on the inside of the windows. By June, That cold rain had become something medieval Europeans had no word for. We might call it freezing rain, but they called it devil's spit. Water that fell as liquid but froze on contact. Entire fields became sheets of ice in summer. Roses bloomed and died in the same hour, encased in crystal tombs. The wheat, which should have been knee-high and green, stood stunted and yellow. The barley rotted in the earth before it could sprout. The rye grew, but wrong-twisted, black, infected with something that would later be recognized as ergot, the fungus that causes hallucinations and gangrene. Some villagers, desperate for any harvest, ate it anyway. They danced themselves to death in the streets, laughing as their fingers turned black and fell off. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's return to Johannes and his family, because their story is everyone's story. By late May, Johannes had stopped joking about anything. The constant rain had ruined the roads, making trade impossible. No merchants could travel, which meant no cloth could be sold, which meant no coins for bread. Not that there was bread to buy. The baker Michel had closed his ovens now. Grain meant no flour, meant no purpose to the fire. June brought the first death in Crassy-la-Chapelle. Not from starvation, not yet. Old Catherine, who'd survived 70 winters, simply gave up. She announced at Sunday Mass that God had abandoned them, walked home, lay down in her bed, and willed herself to die. The priest called it despair, a mortal sin. But privately, he envied her escape. The real horror began in July, when the rain briefly stopped. For 3 days, the sun appeared, weak and watery but present. The villagers rushed to salvage what they could, to plant anything that might grow before autumn. They worked day and night, hands bloody from tearing at the muddy earth, planting beans, turnips, anything fast-growing. On the 4th day, the hail began. Not regular hail. Chunks of ice the size of fists, driven sideways by winds that shouldn't exist in summer. They shattered shutters, killed chickens, knocked full-grown men unconscious. When it stopped, nothing remained of those desperate plantings. The fields looked like they'd been trampled by an army of giants. That's when Johannes made his first, unthinkable choice. He killed one of his cows, not for meat not, yet but for mercy. It was starving, crying constantly, too weak to stand. He told his children it had gotten sick, but Marie knew. She saw him save the blood in buckets, saw him portion it carefully with their dwindling barley. Blood pudding would keep them alive another week. Argus arrived wearing winter's clothes. Frost in the mornings, ice on the water buckets, breath misting even at noon. The second cow died on its own, and Johannes counted it lucky. They ate everything: the meat, the organs, the marrow from the bones. They boiled the hide for soup. They ground the bones for flour. Nothing was waste, because waste meant death. Brother Thomas of Westminster Abbey wrote something strange in his chronicle that summer. The heavens have forgotten how to cease their tears. At first, monks like Thomas saw it as God testing their faith. A brief punishment, maybe for the wars between England and Scotland, maybe for the French king arresting the Pope. Surely it would pass. But then came the letters from sister monasteries. From Cologne, our fields are lakes. From Florence, the Arno has swallowed 3 villages. From Krakow, the children ask what the sun looked like. What terrified Thomas wasn't the rain itself, it was the temperature. In July, the height of summer, he could see his breath while saying morning prayers. Ice formed on the altar wine. And still the rain fell. The monastery's chronicle, which Thomas kept with meticulous care, tells us exactly when normal ended and nightmare began. June 23rd, the eve of St. John, traditionally celebrated with bonfires that burned until dawn. That year, no fire would stay lit. The rain fell horizontally, driven by winds that belonged to December, not midsummer. Thomas wrote, "The brothers attempted 7 times to light the sacred fire. Each time, the rain doused it before a single prayer could be spoken. Prior William declared it a sign of what he dared not say." Thomas had been corresponding with monasteries across Christendom for 20 years. His position as chronicler meant he received letters from abbeys in Scotland to Sicily, from Ireland to Poland. Usually, these letters discussed theological matters, requested copied manuscripts, or shared news of appointments and deaths. But starting in July 1315, every letter carried the same message, dressed in different words. Something was terribly wrong with God's creation. From Melrose Abbey in Scotland came a letter that made Thomas's hands shake. "Brother, we write to you from hell, frozen over. It is July, yet we break ice from our wells each morning. The barley stands drowned in fields that have become swamps. Yesterday, we found a shepherd frozen to death. In July, Brother Thomas. He was young, strong, only 20 summers. We found him standing upright, eyes open, still holding his crook. The sheep around him were ice statues. Have we entered the end times? The abbot of Cluny in France sent word that would have been dismissed as madness any other year. The vine withers as if cursed. The soil rejects all seed. We have consulted. Our oldest records nothing, speaks of summer frost, of hail in August, of rain that burns like ice. Our farmers weep in the fields, beating the mud with their fists, begging it to remember its purpose." From the German monasteries came increasingly frantic reports. The prior of Reichenau wrote, "Lake Constance rises daily. Entire villages now exist only as church bells tolling beneath the waves. We ring our own bells in answer, but God remains deaf. The rain tastes of sulphur. Birds fall from the sky mid-flight, frozen solid. What sin has mankind committed to earn such wrath?" But it was a letter from an Italian monastery that contained the most chilling observation. Brother Antonio of Monte Cassino, a learned man who'd studied both scripture and natural philosophy, wrote, "This is not divine punishment. Brother Thomas, I have read the ancient texts, Greek and Roman both. This happened before. They called it the years without summer. Crops failed, empires fell, and mankind retreated to caves. We are not being punished. We are being erased." Thomas himself had begun keeping detailed records of the weather, something unprecedented for the time. His entries from July 1315 read, "Like fever dreams. July 4th, Feast of St. Ulrich. Rain for 16 straight hours. Temperature cold enough that we wore winter robes to matins. 2 brothers collapsed during prayers, their lips blue. July 11th. The rain has not ceased for 40 hours. We cannot light fires. We eat cold porridge and pray with numb fingers. Brother Matthew suggests we are experiencing Noah's flood again. Prior William had him whipped for heresy. But privately, we all wonder. July 19th. Something impossible today. The rain froze as it fell, coating everything in ice. In July, the vegetable garden is destroyed. Every plant encased in crystal, beautiful and dead. We gather to pray, but the words stuck in our throats. How do you pray when creation itself seems broken? The correspondence between monasteries became increasingly desperate as summer crawled toward autumn. They began sharing survival techniques rather than theological debates. How to keep manuscripts from molding in the constant damp. How to preserve food when nothing would dry. How to maintain faith when every prayer for sun was answered with more rain. From Prague came instructions for building underground storage that might resist the water. From Dublin came recipes for making bread from acorns and chestnuts. From Rome came silence. The Holy See had problems of its own. With the Tiber flooding the papal palace repeatedly, Thomas noted something else, something that wouldn't be fully understood for centuries. The rain wasn't uniform. It would pound. One region while barely touching another 20 miles away. But those dry spots weren't lucky, they were cursed differently. Without rain, but with temperatures below freezing in summer, crops still died. Wells still froze. People still starved. A letter from the Bishop of Bergen in Norway contained an observation that haunts historians today. The merchants from Iceland have not come. They were due in May, as always. It is now August. Ships sent to investigate found the sea routes blocked by mountains of ice that should not exist in summer, or perhaps should not exist at all. The sailors speak of icebergs, tall as cathedrals, moving south like an army of frozen giants. By late August, Thomas's own entries had taken on a tone of barely controlled panic. We have begun rationing in August. The harvest is already lost, and we must survive on stores meant for winter. But what winter awaits us if summer itself has become frozen? Prior William no longer speaks of God's tests. He speaks of God's absence. The most telling entry comes from September 3rd. Brother Francis asked me today why I still write these chronicles. Who will read them? Who will survive to care about the weather of a dead year? I had no answer. I write because the act of writing means I still believe in tomorrow. When I stop writing, I stop hoping. So I write of rain, of cold, of death creeping closer. I write because someone must witness the ending of the world. Imagine watching your entire years work everything you need to survive a rotting in the field before your eyes. Not failing to grow, not dying from drought, but literally dissolving into grey sludge. A French peasant named Guillaume left us. A rare written account dictated to a priest. The wheat stood tall and green in June, promising the best harvest in memory. By August, it was black soup. The smell, God forgive me, it smelled like death before death had even come. But here's where our story takes its first dark turn. The failed harvest of 1315 was just the opening act. Because while the peasants mourned their rotted grain, something else was happening. Something that would transform a bad harvest into an apocalypse. Guillaume of Soissons was not a typical peasant. He'd served in the king's army, learned his letters during a campaign, and returned home with enough silver to rent 5 strips of prime farmland. His account, preserved because the priest thought it might matter someday, gives us the only peasants. I view of the catastrophe unfolding in those fields. I have seen men die with their guts spilling onto French soil. Gidim told the priest. But watching my wheat die was worse. A man dies once. My wheat died every day for 60 days, and each morning I watched it die again. The process was unlike anything farmers had encountered. Usually, crop failure was quick frost, drought, or pests. You knew within days if you were ruined. But 1315 tortured them with hope. Gideon described walking his fields each dawn, and each dawn finding a new horror. First, the stalks grew too fast. In June, they shot up like they were racing toward heaven. We thought ourselves blessed. My wife danced between the rows, saying we'd have enough to sell, enough to buy that ox we'd dreamed of. The children planned what they'd eat at harvest feast: honey cakes, white bread, meat every Sunday until Christmas. But the unnatural growth was a warning, not a blessing. The constant rain and bizarre temperature swings had triggered something in the planter. Desperate attempt to reproduce before dying. The stalks grew tall but hollow. The kernels formed but never filled. By July, the color started changing. Not all at once. First, little spots like rust on a blade. We told ourselves it was nothing, just moisture. It would pass, but the spots spread. They merged, they consumed. A field that was green at sunrise would be brown by sunset. What Gidim was describing, though he couldn't know it, was a perfect storm of plant diseases. The cold, wet conditions had created ideal breeding grounds for multiple fungi. Stem rust, leaf blight, and ergot attacked simultaneously. But ergot was the cruelest. It didn't just destroy the grain, it transformed it into poison. The heads of wheat turned black and swollen, like fingers left too long in water. When you touched them, they burst, releasing clouds of black dust that made you cough blood. My neighbor Henry, trying to save something, anything, gathered these black kernels. His family ate bread made from them. Within 3 days, his children were screaming about devils in the walls. His wife's fingers turned black and fell off. Henry himself danced naked in the square until his heart burst. The aristocracy, watching from their castles, initially felt secure. They had stores from previous years, contracts with merchants, the ability to import grain. The Lord of Soissons, Robert de Courtenay, even rode through the failing fields in July, telling the peasants not to despair, that he would reduce their taxes, that no one would starve. But Lord Robert didn't understand what Gudayam understood. This wasn't one bad harvest. This was the end of agriculture itself. The ground changed. Gillam explained. It wasn't soil anymore. The rain had been falling so long, so hard, that all the good earth washed away. What remained was grey clay. That wouldn't hold seed, wouldn't grow weeds, wouldn't even grow the grass. It was like God had salted the earth, but with water instead of salt. By August, desperation drove innovation. Farmers tried everything their ancestors had never dreamed of. They built fires in the fields, trying to dry the soil. They dug drainage ditches that filled faster than they could empty them. They brought their livestock to sleep among the crops, hoping animal warmth might save something. An educated monk observing these efforts wrote, "They perform rituals that border on paganism, dancing naked under the full moon, burying live cats at field corners, bleeding themselves onto the soil. They have forgotten Christ and remembered older, darker gods, yet still the crops fail." The nobility began to panic when they realized the Implications. No harvests meant no taxes. No taxes meant no armies. No armies meant no power. The entire feudal system depended on agricultural surplus. Without it, civilization itself would collapse. The Bishop of Reims recorded a meeting of local lords in August 1315. Lord Thibaut suggested we take what grain remains by force, store it in our castles, and let God sort the living from the dead. Lord Gautier proposed we sell our lands to Italian merchants who don't yet know of our catastrophe. Lord Felipe said nothing, just sharpened his sword throughout the meeting. We all knew what he was thinking. When the starving masses come, sharp steel might buy us more time than prayer. But it was Gwellem's final observation that proved most prophetic. The worst part wasn't the hunger we knew was coming. It was what hunger would make us become. I saw my neighbor Marcel looking at his plump daughter differently. Not with fathers. Love with a butcher's calculation. I saw wives eyeing husbands who'd grown too weak to work. I saw children forming packs, like wolf cubs learning to hunt. The priest asks me what I think God wants from us. I tell him God is done wanting. Now he's taking, and he's going to keep taking until there's nothing left but rain and mud and sigh. And mud and sigh. The memory of what men used to be before they became animals again. The failed harvest of 1315 wasn't measured in bushels of lost grain. It was measured in the systematic destruction of hope. Every rural community in Europe had lived with the same rhythm for 1,000 years. Plant in spring, tend in summer, harvest in autumn, survive on stores through winter. That cycle was civilization. And in 1315, the cycle broke. By September, even the weeds had given up. Fields that should have been golden with wheat or barley were instead grey seas of mud, punctuated by the black skeletons of dead trees. The only things that grew were fungous, bulbous things that appeared overnight in colours nature had never intended. Purple, electric blue, sick yellow. Children who ate them died laughing. Adults who ate them died screaming. The recording. Priest added his own note to Gwillem's testimony. This man speaks truth. I have seen the fields myself. They look like God's own graveyard, waiting for the corpses that will soon fill them. We are not facing a famine. We are facing an extinction. May whoever finds this record pray for our souls, for by the time you read this, we will surely be past praying for ourselves. In September 1315, a strange sickness appeared among the cattle of Norfolk. Within days, it spread to sheep, then pigs, then horses. The animals didn't just die, they died screaming. A contemporary account describes cattle crying like humans. In their agony, their tongues swollen black, their eyes weeping blood. Modern historians call it marin, but medieval Europeans had another name for it. Devil's touch, because healthy animals would drop dead mid-step. A cow giving milk at dawn would be a corpse by noon, and the speed of transmission defied Logicantia herds gone in hours. But I haven't told you the worst part yet. The animals that survived. They changed. Horses began eating meat. Pigs turned. Feral, forming packs that hunted. And the rats. The rats disappeared entirely. Where did they go? That mystery wouldn't be solved for another 30 years, when they returned, carrying something far worse than hunger. The first recorded death was a prize bull named Samson, owned by the Earl of Norwich, worth more than most villagers earned. In a year, Samson was protected like royalty-sheltered stable, imported feed, 3 stable boys attending him constantly. On September 8th, he was healthy enough to breed. By September 9th, he was dead, his massive body twisted in angles that bones shouldn't allow. Foam tinged pink with blood dried around his mouth. The Earl's stable master, a methodical man named Walter, documented what happened next with the precision of someone who knew he was witnessing something unprecedented. The sickness jumped from Samson to the cows without touch, without sharing water, without even sharing air. They were in separate barns, yet by sunset, 17 were dead. Their deaths were not peaceful. They bellowed with voices that sounded human. They thrashed until their bones broke through their hides. They died with their eyes open, staring at something we could not see. Within a week, every cow in Norfolk was either dead or dying. But the disease didn't respect species boundaries. Sheep began falling next, their wool turning grey overnight before they collapsed. Then pigs, usually hardy enough to survive anything, started dying in ways that defied nature. They'd squeal for hours, a sound witnesses compared to children, screaming before their hearts simply exploded. A traveling merchant named Otto from Flanders recorded what he saw on the roads. "I have traveled these paths for 20 years. I know where every farm keeps its herds. Today, I counted 4,000 dead cattle between Lynn and Norwich. They lie where they fell in fields, on roads, some still standing upright, held by mud that is frozen around their legs. The smell reaches you a mile before you see them. Sweet rot mixed with something chemical, like copper left in vinegar. The speed of death was matched only by its strangeness. Animals died in patterns that suggested intelligent entire herds forming perfect circles before collapsing inward. Flocks of sheep arranging themselves in lines before dying in sequence, like dominoes. Witnesses spoke of animals appearing to communicate across species before death, horses whinnying to cows who lowed back, as if sharing some terrible knowledge. But then came the transformations among survivors, and this is where chronicle accounts become almost too bizarre to believe, except that multiple independent sources confirm the same phenomena. Sir William de Ross, a knight with lands across Yorkshire, wrote to the Archbishop of York, "Your Grace must believe what I write, though it sounds like madness. My destrier, Caesar, a warhorse I've ridden into 3 battles, has begun hunting. Not grazing, hunting. I watched him corner a rabbit, kill it with his hooves, and eat it. He tears flesh with teeth never meant for meat. Other horses flee from him now. He stands alone in his paddock, blood on his muzzle, waiting for something none of us understand. The pigs were worse. Those that survived the plague didn't return to their pens. They grouped together in the forests, moving in coordinated packs. A woodcutter named Thomas testified to the Bishop of Ely. 20 of them, maybe more, moving like wolves, but smarter than wolves. They set ambushes. They used one injured piglet as bait to draw a merchant from his cart. When he climbed down to help him, the others came from the trees. We found his bones 3 days later, picked clean, arranged in a pile like they were showing off. The transformation wasn't limited to behavior. Physical changes occurred that medieval veterinarians couldn't explain. Horses grew longer teeth, sharp enough to tear meat. Pigs developed thicker hides that arrows couldn't pierce. Chickens that survived grew black feathers, regardless of their original coloring, and their eggs when cracked, contained blood instead of yolk. A learned monk, Brother Adlard, who had studied Arabic texts on animal husbandry, proposed a theory. The beasts know something we do not. They sense the world itself is dying and are changing to survive in whatever hellscape follows. They are becoming what they need to be. The question is, what does that make us? Who cannot change? The economic implications were immediate and catastrophic. Medieval society ran on animal power. Oxen pulled plows. Horses carried knights. Sheep provided wool. Cattle gave milk and meat. Without them, agriculture collapsed entirely. You couldn't plant without oxen. You couldn't travel without horses. You couldn't stay warm without wool. The reeve of a manor in Lincolnshire left records showing the speed of collapse. September 1st, 200 cattle, 500 sheep, 60 pigs, 20 horses. October 1st, 3 cattle, 12 sheep, 0 pigs, 2 horses. The 2 horses that remain will not accept saddle or bridle. They watch us with eyes that show too much white. We dare not approach them. Desperate attempts at prevention failed spectacularly. Some communities tried isolating healthy animals, only to watch them die faster in confinement. Others attempted ancient remedies, hanging holly over stable doors, painting crosses in lamb's blood on barns, burying horse skulls at crossroads. The Bishop of Winchester ordered all animals blessed with holy water. They died mid-blessing, falling dead at the priest's feet. The most disturbing account comes from a monastery in Somerset, where Brother Francis observed something that shouldn't have been possible. The rats are gone. All of them. Not dead, we've found no bodies, simply vanished. The cats who hunted them sit in empty granaries, mewing at shadows. The barn owls have stopped hunting, stopped calling. Some have been found dead with full bellies, as if they ate something that killed them from within. But there are no rats. Where did they go? Into the walls, under the earth, or somewhere else entirely, somewhere they can wait out what's coming. This observation would prove prophetic. The rats had indeed gone somewhere deep into Eastern European forests, into cave systems, into places where they could breed and change and feast on the endless supply of corpses the famine would provide. When they returned in the 1340s, they brought the Black Death with them, as if they'd been preparing their revenge for 30 years. But in September 1315, all anyone knew was that the animals were dying or changing, and without them, human survival became nearly impossible. The social contract that had existed between human and beast for millennia, we feed you, you serve us, shattered completely. Nature itself had declared war on civilization, and the animals were its first casualties. In London, December 1315, something unprecedented happened. A wealthy merchant named Richard de Barkin tried to buy bread with a gold coin worth more than most people saw in a lifetime. The baker laughed in his face. "Can your gold fill my children's bellies? Can it bring back the grain?" This is the moment medieval Europe's entire economic system shattered. For the first time in recorded history, food became more valuable than gold. The price of wheat increased 800% in 6 months. But those are just numbers. Let me tell you what that really meant. Richard de Barkin wasn't just any merchant. He controlled the wine trade from Bordeaux to London, owned 3 ships, and held contracts with the royal household. His wealth was legendary. He'd once bought an entire street in London just to evict a rival. On that December morning, he walked into Thomas Baker's shop on Bread Street carrying a gold noble, a coin worth 80 silver pence, enough to buy a horse. Thomas Baker, his hands still dusted with the last of his flour, looked at the coin like it was a stone. "I have one loaf left," he said, "my last flour. When it's gone, I close my doors forever. That loaf goes to my children. Your gold cannot create grain from nothing." Richard, accustomed to gold opening every door, placed 2 more nobles on the counter. Thomas swept them onto the floor. "Take your metal to the Thames and see if the fish will trade bread for it. I'll keep my loaf." The story spread through London within hours, not because a rich man was refused bread, but because everyone suddenly understood. The fundamental assumption of civilization that money could buy necessities had died. The keeper of the Royal Exchange, Simon de Canterbury, recorded the complete collapse of monetary meaning. December 1st, 1 penny buys a loaf. December 15th, 1 shilling buys a loaf. December 30th, 1 pound buys a loaf. January 13, 16, no amount buys a loaf, for there are no loaves to buy. But the breakdown went deeper than inflation. The very concept of value imploded. A manuscript from Guildhall records an exchange that would have been incomprehensible months earlier. Margaret Carpenter traded her wedding ring, passed down 5 generations, for 2 turnips. John Smithson offered his house for a ham. The hams. Owner refused. The guild system, which had regulated trade for centuries, collapsed overnight. The worshipful company of bakers, once among London's most powerful guilds, disbanded when 8 of 12 members died trying to defend their shops from crowds. Their final record, dated January 3rd, 1316, states, "We dissolve this fellowship, as there is nothing left to fellow over. May God forgive what we have become." In Paris, the situation grew even more surreal. The provost of merchants, attempting to maintain order, issued daily price controls. Every morning, he'd announce the maximum legal price for bread. Every evening, bakers would ignore it entirely. One baker, hauled before the provost for charging 30 times the legal rate, responded, "Hang me if you wish. My corpse will bake no bread. Pay my price or starve legally, those are your choices." The relationship between social classes inverted overnight. A peasant with a hidden store of grain wielded more power than a duke with chests of gold. The Chronicle of St. Denis's records, the Count of Champagne, among the realm's richest men, was seen begging at a farmer's door. The farmer, who once would have been flogged for looking the Count in the eye, kept him waiting 3 hours before trading a sack of mouldy oats for the Count's sword, armor, and signet ring. Venice, Europe's commercial heart, tried to maintain normalcy through imports. The Doge sent ships to Egypt, to Constantinople, to anywhere grain might exist. Most never returned. Those that did brought news that shattered hope. The catastrophe wasn't regional. From Ireland to Poland, from Scotland to Sicily, the earth had stopped providing. A Venetian merchant's letter to his partner survives. "I have 40,000 ducats in gold. Yesterday, I tried to buy bread with it all. The baker said he'd rather throw his last loaf to the fish than trade it for coins. I offered him my palazzo. He laughed and said, 'Can I eat marble? Can I digest paintings? We have invented money, created banking, built commerce. None of it matters when there is nothing to buy.'" The church, traditionally the provider of last resort, faced impossible mathematics. The Abbey of Cluny's accounts show their dilemma starkly. We have grain for 300 souls for 6 months. 7,000 souls crowd our gates. If we feed all 4, compassion's sake, all die in 3 weeks. If we feed only our brothers, we survive but lose our purpose. Christ multiplied loaves in Phaesus. We can only divide and subtract. Some monasteries chose martyrdom through generosity, opening their stores until empty, then dying with those they tried to save. Others became fortresses, monks armed with clubs, defending walls, while starving crowds pleaded outside. The abbot of Glastonbury wrote, "We have become what we swore never to be, choosers of who lives and who dies. Each grain of wheat is a decision. Each meal is a judgment. We are not God, yet we play him daily." The collapse of money created new forms of trade that horrified contemporary observers. The Bishop of Lincoln recorded, "Women sell themselves, not for coin, but for bread. A loaf buys what gold cannot. Mothers auction their children to whoever can feed them. These are not choices. These are mathematics of survival." In Hamburg, they developed a grotesque solution: the flesh market. Not selling human flesh not yet, but selling the promise of it. People would sign contracts pledging their bodies after death in exchange for food while living. A German merchant wrote, "The dying sell their future corpses for present bread. Buyers mark their purchases, waiting like vultures. When someone falls, arguments break out over whose property they've become." The English crown attempted to maintain control through force. Edward II issued proclamations making food hoarding punishable by death. The result: those with food hid it better. Royal agents searching for hidden grain often found families dead of starvation, sitting around empty tables, having hidden their food so well they couldn't find it themselves in their final delirium. A royal clerk named William de Dean recorded, "The futility. We hanged a man for hiding grain. The crowd watching the execution fought over his shoes before he stopped kicking. We cannot hang hunger. We cannot execute starvation. The king commands the rain to stop, the crops to grow, the natural order to restore itself. The rain continues. The king might as well command the dead to rise." By February 1316, even the concept of theft had changed. How could taking food be a crime when not taking it meant death? London's courts stopped prosecuting food theft after jurors refused to convict. One judge wrote, "A man stole bread from a child. The child's mother killed the thief with her bare hands. Who is the criminal? Who is the victim? Our laws were written for a world where food existed. That world is gone." The most profound change was in how people understood wealth itself. For 1,000 years, wealth meant gold, land, titles, power. Now it meant calories. The Archbishop of Canterbury observed, "A beggar with a hidden turnip is richer than a lord with a castle." We spent centuries accumulating treasures that now mean nothing. We should have been stockpiling grain. But who could imagine a world where gold couldn't buy bread? Who could conceive of money itself becoming worthless? This economic collapse wasn't temporary. Even after the harvests eventually returned, the absolute faith in currency never fully recovered. People remembered when gold meant nothing, when coins were just metal, when the entire elaborate system of commerce crumbled before the simple reality of hunger. They remembered when the only currency that mattered was food, and the only exchange rate was survival. Agnes's Norwich recorded in her household accounts the progression of what her family ate as 1316 dawned. January, barley bread mixed with sawdust. February, acorn flour and ground bones. March, boiled leather and tree bark. April's entry is just one line. We no longer record what we eat. The creativity of starvation is horrifying. Pine needles ground into paste. Clay mixed with the last drops of milk to make it filling. Parents secretly bleeding themselves at night to mix blood into their children's gruel for protein. But in the city of Erfurt, they discovered something that would haunt Europe's collective memory forever. The local tanner, a man who had grown mysteriously fat while others starved, was found to have a peculiar source of leather. The city records state only, he was burned alive by common consent, and none would speak of what was found in his cellar. Agnes of Norwich was a merchant's widow who'd kept meticulous household accounts for 20 years. Her ledger, preserved in Norwich Cathedral, transforms from mundane records into a descent through hell. Her husband had died in late 1315, leaving her with 4 children and what seemed like adequate stores. She'd managed households through hard times before. But this was different. January 1316. Mix true barley with sawdust from Thomas Carpenter's shop. 1 part grain to 1 part wood. The children notice but do not complain. The sawdust fills their bellies even if it provides no sustenance. We tell ourselves it is fiber, like bran. We pretend not to see the splinters in their stall. The recipe sections of her ledger became increasingly elaborate as real ingredients vanished. Acorn bread. Gather acorns before the pigs find them. Boil. 7 times to remove bitterness, the water turns black as sign. Dry what remains. Grind with stone's mill wheels are too precious for such base material. Mix with water and anything that binds egg. If God provides, blood if he doesn't. Bake until it stops smelling of forest rot. By February, even her precise nature couldn't hide the desperation. Bone meal from the butcher, he claims it's sheep, but the fragments look human-sized. I do not ask. Mix with the last acorn flour. Add melted snow-clean snow from rooftops, not the ground where the dead have lain. The children eat, their teeth hurt from the grinding. Better tooth pain than belly pain. A travelling monk who sheltered with Agnes that February wrote his own account. The widow feeds her children soup that is merely hot water with leather boiled until it releases some essence of the animal it once was. She watches them drink it with such intensity as if her gaze could transform it into beef stew. The youngest boy asks what meat this is. She says it is shukau. He accepts this. The substitutions became a science. Flemish merchants developed detailed guides for extending food that read like alchemical texts. Pine needle tea provides the sensation of eating when boiled thick enough. Add chalk dust for substance. The stomach believes it is full for precious hours. Warning: more than 3 cups daily causes blood in the urine. In Paris, a baker named Henri Fouquet was arrested for his miracle bread that stayed fresh for weeks. Under torture, he revealed the secret. Ground bones mixed with plaster, baked with real flour, spread only on the outside. People see bread. Smell bread, initially tastes bread, he confessed. By the time they realize it's mostly limestone and corpse dust, they're too hungry to care. The Guild of Physicians in Montpellier documented the physical effects of these substitutions. Patients present with bellies swollen like pregnant women, yet they starve. Cut open after death, we find stomachs packed with clay, leather, wood, pulp, everything except food. They die full of nothing. Their bodies refuse to process tree bark into sustenance, no matter how finely ground, how carefully prepared. Children adapted faster than adults, developing tastes for the impossible. A priest in Reims wrote, "The young ones seek out specific trees, knowing which bark tastes less bitter. They have favorites: soak over ash, young wood over old. They teach each other which mushrooms cause the least pain, which grasses fill the belly longest." Children who should be learning Latin are instead becoming experts in eating the inedible. But March brought innovations that crossed into nightmare. Agnes's ledger, her handwriting now shaky. Martha Fisher says fresh blood from living animals goes further than from the dead. A cup drawn from a cow still walking provides more strength than meat from a week-old corpse. We take turns cutting our last goat, keeping it alive, taking just enough. It screams now when it sees us coming with the bowl. The monastery at Fulda recorded even darker adaptations. Brother Marcus suggests we bleed ourselves in rotation, each monk providing for others. The abbot forbids it, calling it cannibalism by degrees. But when the abbot falls ill, we find he's been secretly bleeding himself to feed the youngest novices. His arms are covered in cuts. He dies drained, literally and figuratively. In London, they discovered people grinding the mortar from between stones of ancient Roman walls. It contained traces of animal blood used in its mixing centuries ago. "They call it stone soup," wrote the sheriff. "They believe Roman blood maintains potency across 1,000 years. The city walls are disappearing as people eat our defenses." The absolute nadir came in Erfurt, where Hermann the tanner had maintained his weight while everyone else became skeletal. His neighbors noticed he always had meat, always had leather to work, even as all animals had died months ago. They noticed, too, that missing persons' clothes appeared in his shop, cleaned and folded. The investigation began when a mother recognized her missing daughter's distinctive birthmark on a piece of leather. The city records are deliberately vague. Found in his cellar, barrels of salt meat bearing no resemblance to any beast, skins hanging that showed tattoos and scars, bones too stray to be cattle, too thick to be pig. The mob didn't wait for trial. They sealed Hermann in his own tanning vat and boiled him alive. His screams lasted 3 hours. No one considered this excessive, but Hermann wasn't unique. Across Europe, the mathematics of survival created impossible choices. A Dutch merchant wrote, "In Amsterdam, we no longer ask what meat is served. We know, we all know, but we eat it and pretend it's pork. The alternative is death. God forgive us, but he's the one who sent this famine." Agnes of Norwich's final food relay entry, April 1316, is indeed just one line. We no longer record what we eat, but she continued writing other observations. May, my youngest son no longer asks for food. June, found Margaret's teeth in her bed. They fell out in the night. July, we have forgotten the taste of bread. August contains no words, just tally marks, possibly counting days, possibly counting deaths. The last entry, September 1316, in a different hand. Agnes died this morning. We found her in the garden, eating earth, smiling. She said it tasted like heaven. We buried her where she fell. The ground was already open from her feeding. We are what remains of her family. We have survived on what she taught us to eat. We have survived on what she refused to eat. Both lessons were love. The great substitution wasn't just about replacing food with non-food. It was about replacing civilization with survival, morality with mathematics, humanity with hunger. Every successful substitution, every recipe for bark bread, every method for making leather edible was both a triumph of human ingenuity and a step toward something inhuman. Here's a question that sounds simple until you're living it. If you have enough food for your family to survive 6 months, but your neighbor's children are dying today, what do? Share and all die in 3 months? Or bar your door and listen to them cry? A priest in Ghent documented these impossible choices. A mother of 4, calculating exactly how much food each child needed based on their chances of survival. The strongest got more, the weakest ... didn't. She loved them all, he wrote. That's why she chose. Father Benedict of Ghent had been a priest for 30 years when the famine came. His parish records, instead of births and deaths, became a chronicle of moral arithmetic that would haunt him until his own death. He wrote not in Latin, but in common Flemish, wanting everyone to understand what survival really cost. Elizabeth van Meer, mother of 4, widow, has grain hidden beneath her floor enough for 6 months if one person eats, 3 months if to eat, 6 weeks if all 5 eat. She came to confession not for absolution but for mathematics. Father, she said, tell me God's formula for choosing which children live. Elizabeth's children ranged from 14 to 3. The eldest, Jan, strong enough to work if work existed. The twins, Marie and Catherine, 9 years old, clever but frail. The youngest, Peter, barely walked but consumed as much as the others. Father Benedict recorded her terrible calculus. She weighs them each week on the merchant scale. Charts their decline. Jan loses weight, slowest his body large enough to consume itself gradually. Peter loses fastest, no reserves in that tiny frame. The twins fall between. She creates equations. If Jan gets double rations for 3 weeks, he might strong enough to steal food for the others. If Peter gets nothing for 3 days, his suffering ends and the others get 9 more days each. These are not thoughts, these are numbers. Cold, merciless numbers. The priest watched Elizabeth transform from mother to mathematician. She no longer sees children. She sees survival probabilities. Jan, 70% chance if fed properly. The twins, 40% each if maintained, but 60% for one if the other stops eating. Peter, 15% regardless. She doesn't cry when she does these calculations. Tears are water the body cannot spare. But Elizabeth wasn't unique. Across Europe, parents performed similar calculations. A merchant in Bruges is left a ledger that makes accountants weep. Assets, 3 children, 1 wife, self, liabilities, love, compassion, memory of better times. Formula for survival. Assets minus liabilities equals tomorrow. In London, a wealthy lawyer named Thomas Hardwick documented his family's rationing system with legal precision. Established a tribunal each morning. Each family member presents their case for food. Activities of previous day weighed against probable future utility. Wife sewing equals quarter ration. Son studying equals eighth ration. Knowledge feeds no one now. Daughter spinning equals half ration. Wool still has value. Baby crying equals no ration. Noise attracts hungry neighbors. The mathematics extended beyond families. Entire communities developed survival algorithms. The village of Wickham created what they called the life lottery. Every Sunday, families drew lots. Winners got the week's communal food. Losers got nothing. But here's the insane part. Families could trade lottery tickets. A mother with one child might sell her chance to a father with four, calculating that certain death with payment beat probable death without. Father Benedict recorded a town meeting that descended into pure calculation. The baker proposed we stop feeding anyone over 50, they've lived their lives. The blacksmith countered, we stop feeding anyone under 5, they're too young to remember better times. Won't miss what they never knew. The mayor suggested we feed only those who can work. The priest asked who would bury the dead. The meeting ended with no decision. Mathematics cannot solve philosophy. The church itself wasn't immune to these calculations. The Bishop of Tonnerre issued guidelines that read like actuarial tables. Orphans under 7, half rations. Orphans 7 to 12. Full rations if they work. Orphans over 12. No rations old enough to fend for themselves. Widows with children, proportional to number of surviving offspring. Widows without children, God will provide. A monastery in Liège developed even more complex formulas. Each monk assessed daily. Prayer hours multiplied by manual labor divided by food consumed. Those whose spiritual productivity falls below temporal consumption must fast until the equation balances. Brother Francis, young and strong, eats daily. Brother Augustine, old and weak, but whose prayers are powerful, eats thrice weekly. We have mathematized the soul. The most heartbreaking account comes from a school teacher in Cologne who tried to save her students. 23 children in my care. Food for 5. I create competitions. Best recitation gets bread. Fastest runner gets soup. But children understand. They know it's not about merit, but about choosing who dies educated. Little Wilhelm, bright as sunrise, asked me, Teacher, if I die today, can Thomas have tomorrow's lesson and my portion? He was 7. He understood the trade. Some communities tried to remove human choice from the equation entirely. In Basel, they built what they called the Wheel of Fortune, a great spinning disc with names. Each day, spin the wheel. Where it stops determines who eats. Pure chance. No favoritism, no guilt. The wheel chose who lived and died. Citizens preferred random cruelty to deliberate choice. A Venetian merchant named Carlo Dandolo wrote the most clinical assessment. Sentiment is luxury. Love is liability. Calculate thus. Calories needed per pound of human maintained. Work output possible per calorie invested. Return on investment measured in days survived. My eldest son provides best ratio, strong enough to forage, smart enough to steal. My youngest daughter provides worse, consumes without producing. The middle children are variables, depending on daily performance. I am not a monster. I am an equation. But perhaps the most disturbing mathematics came from those who calculated backwards, not from food to survival, but from death to food. How many must die for the rest to live? If the population halves, do rations double? These calculations appeared in secret documents, burned after reading. But Father Benedict saw enough to write. They draw circles on maps. This district has grain for 1,000. Population 3,000. Solution: ensure 2,000 die quickly. How? Bar thee. Gates: poison the wells. Spread disease. These are not plans of war. These are plans of peace. Peaceful elimination of excess population. The psychological toll of these calculations broke minds. Elizabeth Van Meer, the mother from the beginning, eventually snapped. Father Benedict found her one morning, feeding all her children equally, generously, using their entire store in one meal. She said. She solved the equation, he wrote. Everyone dies together, full, happy, as a family. No choosing. No survivors bearing guilt. Mathematical perfection. 0 equals 0. But she couldn't do it. At the last moment, she hid a portion, gave it to Jan, the eldest, and walked into the forest with the 3 younger children. They found her frozen arms around the little ones, all of them smiling. Jan survived, found by traders, raised by strangers. Years later, he became a mathematician, obsessed with solving unsolvable problems, never saying why. Father Benedict's final entry on the mathematics of survival: God gave us multiplication be fruitful and increase. The devil gave us division, choose who lives and dies. We have become expert in dark arithmetic, subtracting souls, dividing families, calculating the minimum viable population. We measure love in ounces of grain, weigh souls against bread. Calculate the exchange rate between mercy and survival. Every choice is an equation. Every equation is a condemnation. Every survivor is a mathematician who solved for x, where x equals continued existence and all other variables equals 0. The mathematics of survival reduced human society to its most basic algorithm. Who dies so others live? Every family, every community, every institution faced this equation. Some solved for maximum survival, others for minimum suffering. None solved for justice, because justice requires abundance, and abundance was memory. These calculations left scars that lasted generations. Survivors could never forget the arithmetic they'd performed, the variables they'd eliminated, the human constants they'd reduced to 0. They'd learned that civilization was just addition, add food, add comfort, add morality, and that survival, which is subtraction, subtract the weak, subtract the old, subtract love itself if necessary. In the end, the only sum that mattered was greater than 0. In the summer of 1316, something extraordinary happened. The rain stopped for 3 weeks, just long enough for desperate farmers to plant whatever seeds remained. The chroniclers called it God's mercy. Markets opened, people celebrated. A merchant in Bruges wrote to his partner, "The curse is lifted. Prepare the wagons." The crops grew with supernatural speed in the brief sunshine. Green shoots everywhere. Hope returned like a physical warmth. Families who had been preparing to separate to increase survival chances made plans to reunite. Then came August 10th, 1316, the day the hail began. Chunks of ice the size of goose eggs. For 3 hours, every single plant that had grown in those precious 3 weeks was obliterated. Not damaged. Obliterated. Crushed into the mud so thoroughly that you couldn't tell fields from road. The Bruges. Merchant's next letter contained only one line. God has abandoned us entirely. But let me tell you how those 3 weeks unfolded, because understanding the height of hope makes the fall into despair that much more devastating. July 18th, 1316. Dawn came without rain for the first time in 14 months. Not drizzle, not mist, but actual absence of water from the sky. In Paris, people stood in the streets, faces upturned, confused by the sensation of dryness. Children who'd been born during the deluge touched sunlight for the first time and screamed they thought they were burning. Brother Michel of Cluny recorded the moment. The clouds parted like curtains drawn by God's own hand, light actual. Golden light poured onto the earth. Monks fell to their knees, not in prayer, but in disbelief. We had forgotten the sun could exist without water. Word spread faster than plague. Church bells rang continuously, not for death this time, but for resurrection. In every village, town, and city, people emerged from their homes like creatures crawling from caves. Pale, skeletal, blinking in brilliance they'd forgotten existed. The merchant Jacob van Bruges wrote to his partner Hans in Antwerp with trembling hand. The curse is lifted. God has remembered us. The rain has stopped. Prepare, the wagons will have grain to trade by autumn. Tell everyone survival is possible again. Markets that had been closed for months exploded back to life. Not with food, there was still no food, but with hope transformed into commerce. People traded promises, futures, possibilities. A farmer would pledge his upcoming harvest for tools. A baker would promise future bread for present shelter. The economy, dead for a year, gasped back to life on nothing but anticipated abundance. The seeds came from everywhere and nowhere, hidden in walls, buried in yards, hoarded in attics. Every kernel that had been saved, just in case, was brought into the light. Some families had protected seed grain while their children starved, betting everything on this exact moment. They'd been called monsters. Now they were visionaries. The planting was religious ecstasy mixed with desperate efficiency. In Normandy, the entire surviving population, nobles, merchants, priests, children, went into the fields. The Duke of Normandy himself, who hadn't touched soil in his lifetime, was seen on his knees, pressing seeds into earth with tears streaming down his face. A young girl named Marguerite wrote in her diary, "Papa says we're planting hope. Mama says we're planting survival. I think we're planting prayers and watching to see if God makes them grow." And grow they did. The crops erupted from the soil with impossible vigor. Wheat that should take weeks to sprout appeared in 3 days. Barley shot up overnight. Beans climbed their poles so fast you could watch them move. The chroniclers, usually skeptical men, wrote of agricultural miracle. It is as if the earth, starved for so long of its purpose, is making up for lost time, wrote the Bishop of Rouen. The crops grow with such speed that farmers sleep in their fields, afraid to miss the harvest moment. Green spreads across the land like God painting with life itself. The markets transformed overnight. The champagne fairs, dead for 2 years, announced their return. Merchants who'd hidden through the catastrophe emerged with old contracts, ready to trade. Ships that had rotted in harbors were hastily repaired. Trade routes, abandoned to bandits and nature, were cleared by communities working together for the first time in months. In Florence, they held an impromptu festival. Not planned, just spontaneous explosion of joy. Musicians who'd sold their instruments, played drums, made from barrels. Dancers who'd forgotten how to smile, laughed until they cried. Children who'd never known celebration invented it on the spot. An Italian chronicler wrote, "We feast on nothing but hope, and it fills us better than bread ever did." Families made reunion plans. Fathers who'd sent sons away to increase survival odds sent word to return. Mothers who'd placed daughters in convents prepared to bring them home. Communities that had fractured into hostile fragments began to speak of reconciliation. The 3 weeks of sun didn't just grow crops, they grew possibility. A priest in Ghent gave a sermon that captured the moment. "We have walked through the valley of death's shadow. But see, the shadow lifts. The valley blooms. We are Job, tested and found faithful. We are Noah, watching the waters recede. We are Lazarus, called from the tomb." Even the nobility, who'd maintained distance from their starving subjects, joined. The collective delusion. The Count of Flanders announced a harvest festival for September, promising wine from reserves nobody knew existed. The King of France declared that all debts incurred during the unfortunate rain would be forgiven once. The harvest was complete. The Pope issued a bull declaring the famine officially ended by divine intervention. The crops grew so fast that some whispered of dark magic. In Germany, rumors spread that the plants were unnatural, fed by the corpses of the million dead, growing on human fertilizer. But even these whispers were dismissed. Who cared if the wheat grew from graves? The living needed bread. By August 9th, the fields were green carpets of promise. The wheat stood tall, the barley swayed golden, the beans hung heavy on their vines. Another week, maybe 2, and harvest could begin. Calculations were made not of who would die, but of who would live. All of them. All would live. The night of August 9th, strange clouds gathered. Not rain clouds, something else. They glowed with an odd green light. Lightning without thunder. Wind without direction. Animals, the few that remained, became restless. Horses screamed. Dogs howled. Cats vanished entirely. August 10th, 1316. 2:47 in the afternoon. The exact time is known because the clock tower in Bruges stopped when the first hailstone hit it. They fell like God's own artillery. Ice chunks the size of goose eggs, driven by winds that shouldn't exist in August. But these weren't normal hailstones. Witnesses described them as sharp, angular, some shaped like pyramids, others like daggers. They didn't just fall, they attacked in. The fields of Flanders, farmers tried to shield their crops with their own bodies. The hail broke their backs, shattered their skulls, left them dead atop the plants they'd tried to protect. Children sent to bring in animals were found hours later, beaten to death by ice from the sky. But the crops suffered worse. The hail didn't just flatten them, pulverized them, drove them so deep into the mud that archaeologists still find compressed plant matter at that geological layer. 3 weeks of growth erased in 3 hours. Not damage deleted. The fields looked like they'd been scraped clean by God's own hand. When it stopped, silence fell across Europe. Not peaceful silence, the silence of complete despair. People stood in their obliterated fields, unable to speak, unable to cry, unable to comprehend. The hope hadn't been gradually eroded, had been murdered in a single afternoon. Jacob van Vey. Bruges, the merchant who'd written so joyfully to his partner, sent one final letter. Not even a letter, just 8 words on a torn piece of parchment. God has abandoned us entirely. Do not come. The suicides began that evening. Not the slow suicide of starvation, but immediate, decisive ending. Entire families walking hand in hand into rivers. Farmers hanging themselves from trees that overlooked their destroyed fields. Bakers closing themselves in their ovens. The Diocese of Reims recorded 300 suicides in 3 days. Those were just the ones found. A chronicler in Paris wrote, "The cruelty was not in taking the crops. It was in letting them grow first, in letting us believe, in letting us hope. This was not God testing faith. This was God showing us faith is mockery. We are not Job. Job was loved enough to be tested. We are nothing." The 3 weeks of sun had been crueler than 14 months of rain. The rain had killed slowly, allowing adjustment, acceptance. The false hope killed instantly, crushing spirits that had just dared to unfold. Those who'd shared their last seeds, believing in tomorrow, now faced starvation with nothing. Those who'd emerged from hiding, trusting in recovery, were now exposed with nowhere to return. The miracle markets closed forever. When archaeologists excavated